Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey dear friends, imagine closing your eyes tonight and waking up in Victorian England. It is late evening. The streets outside are dark. The gas lamps flicker through the mist, and somewhere nearby, a horse-drawn carriage disappears into the quiet night. You open the door to a narrow Victorian boarding house. Inside, dozens of strangers live beneath the same roof. You don't know their names. You don't know their stories. Yet for the next 30 nights, this house will become your entire world. You will hear footsteps moving across wooden floors, quiet conversations behind thin walls, the clatter of dishes downstairs, and the occasional cough from a room somewhere in the darkness. Every person here has arrived carrying a different past. Some are searching for work. Some have left their families behind. Some are hiding secrets, and others simply have nowhere else to go. Before starting the story, like and subscribe to my channel for more stories. Now, start the story. Tonight, you are one of them. So make yourself comfortable, let the modern world fade away, and step quietly through the front door. Your first night in the Victorian boarding house is about to begin. If you've journeyed here with us before, it's wonderful to see you again, and I truly appreciate you coming back. And if this is your very first time wandering into this cozy nook of the internet, then please get comfortable because you found exactly the spot you were meant to be. Picture this with me. The calendar reads 1872. You are 23 years old, and you've just descended from a train in a city that hums with life. Maybe it's London, perhaps Manchester, Boston, or Philadelphia. You have nothing more than a small bag, a handful of coins, and no clue where you'll rest your head tonight. There is no family here, no apartment waiting for you, no landlord expecting your arrival. The city is alive, roaring all around you with its smokestacks and horse-drawn carriages, the air thick with the scent of coal and damp stone. Then, someone, a stranger with a gentle look in their eyes, points you toward a certain door. It's an unassuming door on a quiet street with a modest brass plate beside it. Two words, so simple they hardly seem to matter. Rooms available. What unfolds inside that house, around that table, within those walls, is one of the most captivating, deeply human, and almost entirely forgotten stories of the entire 19th century. And tonight, we are going to step right through that door together. If this kind of tale is your idea of a perfect evening, and I suspect it might be, it would genuinely mean everything to me if you'd hit that subscribe button now, and maybe give a like while you're at it. Not because an algorithm tells me to ask, but because it truly helps this channel find more people who would appreciate what we share here. And while you're at it, drop a comment below and tell me where you are, what time it is, and what you're sipping. I cherish those little glimpses into your evenings. Now, if you can dim the lights, let the room fall quiet, and let's step back in time. Here's something that might catch you off guard. In the 1850s, according to the National Census of England, 1 out of every 8 homes in the entire country had a lodger living inside it. Not a visitor, not a relative, but a paying stranger. In cities such as Nottingham and York, that number climbed to 1 in 5. By the 1860s, Manchester alone boasted 472 registered lodging houses. And London? Well, London was an entity unto itself. There were entire streets in the East End where every single house on both sides functioned as either a boarding house or a lodging house. Every second door, every second window had strangers behind them. Now, if you're imagining something bleak or desperate, something grim, I want you to hold that thought for just a moment, because the story of the Victorian boarding house is far more layered than that and far more intriguing. Let me take you back to the very beginning. The world that gave rise to the boarding house was a world turning itself inside out. Between 1800 and 1900, the population of England more than doubled. In 1800, London was home to around 900,000 people. By 1900, that number had swelled to more than 6 million. 6 million in a single century. Think about what that actually meant in human terms. Every single week, thousands of young men and women were leaving their villages, leaving behind farms that their families had worked for generations, and flooding into cities they had never laid eyes on before, all in search of work in factories, shops, offices, and trades that simply hadn't existed anywhere else. A 17-year-old girl from Yorkshire arriving in London to find work as a seamstress. A young man from Ireland, 21 years old, following the promise of work on the railways. A clerk from the countryside, fresh from his studies, beginning a position at a city counting house with a salary barely enough to keep him afloat. None of them could afford to rent an entire house. None of them had the time or the knowledge to establish a household of their own, and not a single one of them could cook. This last point was no small matter. In the Victorian era, cooking wasn't just a skill. It was an art form that required years to perfect, demanded equipment that cost more than most workers earned in a month, and consumed hours of daily labor on top of an already taxing workday. A factory worker putting in 12 hours had no stove, no fire, no pots, no coal, and no time. And so, as the historian Wendy Gamber wrote in her important study of 19th-century American boarding houses, workers who couldn't afford to cook for themselves essentially hired others to do it for them. That hired person had a name. She was called the landlady, and she was quietly one of the most powerful figures in Victorian city life. But we'll get to her soon. So, where did all these people go? They went to the boarding house. And here, I want to be careful because the Victorian boarding house wasn't just one thing. It was a whole universe of different worlds, stacked on top of each other like the floors of the houses themselves. At the very top, not in terms of floors, but in terms of respectability, you had what was sometimes called the private boarding house. These were proper townhouses in decent neighborhoods, lace curtains at the windows, a small advertisement in the local paper, and perhaps a discreet brass plate by the door, no larger than a calling card. These houses catered to the respectable middle classes: young clerks, junior officers, unmarried teachers, widowed gentlewomen who had fallen on harder times but still carried themselves with great dignity. Rooms in these houses were private. Meals were served at a common table, and the landlady presided over everything like a small monarch, setting the rules, enforcing the hours, deciding with just a glance who was the right sort of person, and who most certainly was not. Then came the working-class lodging house, cheaper, louder, and rougher around every edge. These were the sorts of places Friedrich Engels wrote about in 1845 when he described the living conditions of England's industrial poor. Multiple people to a room, sometimes multiple people to a bed, a shared kitchen, a shared table, a shared stove that was always either too hot or stone cold. And below, even that were the common lodging houses, the places that respectable Victorians crossed the street to avoid mentioning. Places where for 4 pennies a night, a person could have a bed in a room with however many other bodies happened to be there that evening. The bedding was sometimes stamped with the word "stolen," not as a warning, but as a deterrent, the landlord hoping, perhaps optimistically, that a thief wouldn't want to be caught walking through the city with a blanket that advertised its own origins. Now, here's the question I keep coming back to, and perhaps you're asking it too. Why? Why would a person choose this? Not the desperate working-class lodger who had no other option, but the middle-class clerk, the schoolteacher, the young professional. People who could technically have found a room somewhere else. Why choose to share your life, your meals, your evenings, your thin walls with a group of complete strangers? The answer is layered, and in many ways, it speaks directly to something we still wrestle with today. The first reason was purely practical. The boarding house solved the cooking problem, the heating problem, and the furniture problem all at once. You arrived with your one bag, and suddenly you had a bed, a pillow, breakfast in the morning, and sometimes supper in the evening. No capital required, no kitchen skills needed, no coal merchant to negotiate with. Victorian workers. earning what historians estimate is somewhere between 15 shillings and £1 per week, simply could not afford to replicate on their own what a boarding house provided. The math didn't work any other way. But here is the second reason, and this one is what truly gets me. The boarding house solved something else entirely. It solved loneliness. We tend to assume that loneliness is a modern invention, the plague of screens and social media, people staring at their phones instead of each other. But loneliness is as old as cities. When a 19-year-old girl arrived in Victorian London from a village in the north of England, where she had known every face on every street, the isolation could be terrifying. There was no telephone to call home, no photograph of her mother on a screen in her pocket, just the city and its indifference. The boarding house, for all its faults, and we'll get to every single one of them, I promise, gave her something. It gave her a table, people to eat with, faces she would recognize in the morning, someone to notice if she didn't come down for breakfast. The writer and historian Joseph O'Neill, who spent years researching the Victorian lodging house, described it this way. These people may have spent their nights sharing beds with bugs and strangers, but for many it kept them out of the workhouse and provided something that money alone could not buy: shelter, self-respect, and vital companionship. Self-respect, vital companionship. Those two phrases stayed with me when I first read them, because they aren't the phrases we typically use when we talk about cheap housing. And yet, there they are, tucked into the history of a building most of us have never thought about. Now I want to give you one more piece of this picture, because it completes something important. The boarding house was not only for the poor or the struggling. Some of the most famous names in the history of English literature and American letters spent significant parts of their lives in boarding houses. Walt Whitman, the poet who gave America some of its most beloved words, boarded. Edgar Allan Poe boarded. Herman Melville boarded. Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, the two great philosophers of American self-reliance, both spent time in boarding houses, which is, when you think about it, almost wonderfully ironic. The men who wrote the most passionately about individualism and independence were, in their daily lives, sharing a dining table with 7 strangers and hoping the landlady hadn't watered down the soup again. But here is what makes the Victorian boarding house truly extraordinary. It wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a social laboratory. For the first time in history, you had a space where people from different counties, different classes, different trades, and different backgrounds were forced to sit across from each other at the same table every single day and figure out how to be civil or not. Sometimes they fell in love. Sometimes they became lifelong friends. Sometimes they despised each other with a quiet passion that made every meal feel like a diplomatic summit between two nations on the very edge of war. And sometimes, as in one recorded case from London in 1834, lodgers shared a room with a man who had died and went 3 full days without noticing anything was wrong, which tells you everything you need to know about both the crowding and the spectacular level of minding your own business that Victorian lodging house life required. So, you've just arrived. The door is in front of you. The city is loud behind you. And somewhere inside this ordinary house on this ordinary street, there is a woman waiting who will either make your month one of the most interesting experiences of your entire life, or make you wish you had slept under a bridge. Her name is the landlady, and in the next part of our story, we're going to step into her world, her kitchen, her accounts book, her rules, and discover why she was, without question, the true center of gravity inside every Victorian boarding house that ever existed. Because the door may have been the beginning, but she was everything that came after. There was a certain kind of woman the Victorians never quite knew how to categorize. She wasn't a servant. She gave the orders. She wasn't an aristocrat. She scrubbed her own floors when nobody was watching. She wasn't a wife, at least not anymore. And she was most certainly not a charity case. No matter how thin the margin got between what she spent on coal and what she collected in rent on a Thursday morning. She was the landlady. And I want to make you a small promise before we go any further. By the time this part of the story is finished, you're going to see her differently. Not as the figure of fun that novelists and satirists love to mock. The suspicious widow sniffing around your room for missing cutlery. The harridan who charged extra for candles and called it hospitality. You're going to see her for what she actually was. One of the most resourceful, most quietly resilient human beings the 19th century produced. Let's start with how she got there. Because in almost every case, almost without exception, the Victorian landlady did not choose this life out of ambition. She arrived at the boarding house door the same way most women arrived at difficult circumstances in that era. She had lost something, a husband, most commonly, sometimes to illness, sometimes to accident, sometimes to the kind of slow financial ruin that the Victorian economy was extraordinarily skilled at inflicting on men who had once been comfortable and then simply were not. The historian Wendy Gamber, who spent years studying the boarding house in 19th century America, wrote that boarding housekeeping was women's work almost by default. That landladies, not their spouses, typically met lodgers, collected rents, and presided over dining tables. It was, in Gamber's own phrase, the most common refuge for women who had no other obvious way to keep themselves alive with any dignity intact. And dignity, that was the key word. That was the whole thing. Because a widow in Victorian England who could not maintain appearances, who could not project at least the surface of respectability, faced social consequences that went far beyond mere embarrassment. She faced the workhouse. She faced destitution. She faced the quiet, devastating experience of watching the world treat her as though she had simply ceased to exist. So, she opened her house instead. Think about what that actually required for a moment. She had a building, or she rented one. She presumably had some furniture. She had a kitchen, a fireplace or two, a back garden with a coal store. And she had, in all likelihood, nothing else. No business training, no accounting background, no commercial experience of any kind. Because the Victorian era had taken considerable care to ensure that women of the respectable middle class had absolutely none. What she had was something the era valued almost as much as money. An understanding of domestic management so deep and so automatic that she had been performing it since childhood without ever thinking of it as a skill. She knew how to run a household. She knew how much coal went through a fire in a week. She knew how long a pound of mutton could be stretched across 4 mouths before it became genuinely medically questionable. She knew which tradesmen would extend credit and for how long. And she knew which ones would send a boy around on Saturday morning with an account that had to be settled before the week could end in peace. So she sat down, perhaps at a small writing desk, perhaps at the kitchen table, and she did arithmetic that had no margin for error whatsoever. Here is what that arithmetic looked like in practice. By the 1870s, a respectable middle-class boarding house in London might charge somewhere between 15 shillings and £1 per week per lodger, depending on the floor of the room, the quality of the meals included, and the reputation of the neighborhood. A lodger on the ground floor, with better rooms and parlor access, paid more. A lodger tucked into the third floor back, darker, noisier, closer to the roofline, paid considerably less and was expected to feel vaguely embarrassed about it. A house with, say, 6 paying lodgers might bring in somewhere around £5 a week, which sounds on paper almost comfortable until you factor in the coal. In winter, a boarding house keeping fires in multiple rooms could burn through several tons of coal a season. Then there were the servants' wages. Even a modest house might employ a general servant and perhaps a cook, each earning between 10 and 20 pounds a year in addition to their board. The food, the candles, the lamp oil, the constant grinding cost of linen, because linen sheets, tablecloths, napkins, towels, was the quiet financial disaster of every boarding house that ever opened its doors. It wore out. It was stolen. It was ruined by lodgers who used good napkins to clean their boots and never once mentioned it. One Victorian commentator writing in the 1850s observed that a lodging housekeeper should mentally include an annual budget specifically for things she expected her lodgers to take, not steal, take. The distinction apparently being that a gentleman lodger did not think of himself as stealing the candle from the mantelpiece. He thought of himself as being in his own home, which of course was rather the problem. Now I want to stop here for a moment, because something is bothering me, and I suspect it might be bothering you too. We have been talking about this woman as though she were simply running a business. A tight, careful, precarious little business. But there was another dimension to her life inside that house that business language cannot quite capture. She lived there. She did not go home at the end of the day. She woke up every morning in the same building where her lodgers slept. She ate in the same kitchen where their food was prepared. She heard them on the stairs at night. She knew when one of them had cried, not because she eavesdropped, but because walls in Victorian townhouses were thin as paper, and a grown man sobbing quietly after a long day is not a sound that stays contained. She was, in the most literal sense, never off the clock. The historian who described her position most precisely, I think, was not a historian at all. It was Arthur Conan Doyle, who gave us in his Sherlock Holmes stories the single most famous landlady in the history of English literature, Mrs. Hudson of Baker Street. Watson described her in the story of The Dying Detective as a long-suffering woman. Not only was her sitting room invaded at all hours by strange and often unsavory visitors, but her remarkable lodger showed an eccentricity in his life which must have sorely tried her patience. His incredible untidiness, his habit of firing a revolver at the wall during moments of boredom, his chemical experiments that filled the house with smells that made guests ask with genuine alarm whether something had died. And yet Watson noted his payments were princely. The house, he said, might have been purchased at the price Holmes paid for his rooms over the years. Doyle understood something about the landlady's world that most of his contemporaries either missed or chose not to examine too carefully. She tolerated what she tolerated because she had to, and she extracted what she could in return. That was not callousness. That was survival. But here is the thing that I find genuinely extraordinary about her. And I want you to hold this thought, because I think it changes the whole picture. She had power, real power. The kind that does not announce itself loudly, but that shapes every single interaction in a household from dawn to dark. She decided who got a room and who did not. She set the rules. She controlled access to warmth, to food, to the small comforts that made the difference between a bearable life in a strange city and a completely wretched one. She could, and frequently did, turn a lodger out on a week's notice for any reason that suited her. Too loud, too late, too many suspicious visitors, too many bottles of something coming up the stairs after 10 in the evening. In a world that gave women almost no formal authority over almost anything, the boarding house was a tiny sovereignty entirely her own. She was the absolute monarch of 40 feet of terraced townhouse on a respectable but not fashionable street in some Victorian city. And within those 40 feet, her word was law. Have you ever thought about how rare that was? In a century that did not allow women to vote, that made a married woman's property legally her husband's, that expected a woman of any standing to be dependent on a male relative for almost every formal transaction she might need to conduct, the landlady answered to nobody. She collected rent herself. She signed contracts herself. She hired and fired servants herself. She threw people out herself if it came to it. The Victorian satirists who made such sport of the domineering landlady. The cartoons of her looming in doorways, arms crossed, face like a thundercloud, were, I think, rather more nervous about her than they wanted to admit. Let me tell you about one specific woman, because I think she brings all of this to life in a way that general history sometimes fails to do. Her name was Charlotte Clark. She ran a boarding house in the south of England in the 1860s and 70s, and what we know of her comes from the local newspaper accounts of her time. The sort of notices a provincial paper would run about a well-known local figure. She was described in one such account, published around the time of her death in the early 1880s, as having been in public business for longer than any other landlady in the town. Her amiable and obliging manners, the notice said, had won her many friends. That phrase, amiable and obliging, is worth unpacking, because in the context of boarding house management, amiable and obliging did not mean passive. It meant skill. It meant the particular and demanding art of making 12 different personalities, with 12 different requirements and 12 different temperaments, feel simultaneously at home, while quietly ensuring that none of them cost her more than they were paying. That is not a small skill. Honestly, it is a skill that most people working in hospitality today would recognize immediately and respect enormously. And yet she was exhausted. This is the part of the story that the cheerful histories of Victorian resourcefulness tend to skate past a little quickly. Because the boarding house was not, for the woman running it, a fulfilling entrepreneurial adventure. It was relentless. She was up before the servants. She was the last one to know the fire had gone out in the dining room. She was the one who had to manage the delicate social crisis when the lodger in the second floor front told her, very quietly and with great offense, that the lodger in the second floor back was using the shared landing at 4 in the morning and being, in his words, thoroughly unreasonable about the hour. She was the one who had to sort out the linen accounts every week, decide which tradesmen to pay this week and which to defer to next, calculate whether she could afford a new blanket for the room that had complained about the cold, or whether the old one would survive another winter with one more repair. Winnie Gamber's chapter on the economics of boarding housekeeping gives it perhaps the most honest title in the entire academic literature on the subject. She called it the most cruel and thankless way a woman can earn her living. I want to be honest with you about something. I have read a lot of Victorian social history. A lot. And the women who run through most of it are queens, aristocrats, reformers, writers, women who left records of their own because they had the education and the platform to do so. The landlady never wrote about herself. She was too busy. What we know of her comes from the lodgers who mocked her in their memoirs, the novelists who used her as comic relief, the court records when a dispute over rent or a week's notice went badly enough to require a magistrate. In all of that accumulated noise, her own voice is remarkably quiet, which makes me think, and maybe this is just me being sentimental, but bear with me for a moment, that the most honest monument to the Victorian landlady is not any individual woman's story. It is the fact that without her, the entire mechanism of Victorian urban life would have seized and stopped. The factory clerks would have had no breakfast. The young doctors would have had nowhere to study. The spinsters on limited incomes would have had no respectable roof over their heads. The whole magnificent, grinding, impossible city, London, Manchester, Birmingham, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, ran in part on the invisible labor of a woman who woke before dawn, kept the coal budget in her head, and charged 15 shillings a week for a room that was probably worth every penny she asked. And she had one more quality. One last thing I want to leave you with before we step through the rest of this house. She noticed. She noticed everything. She noticed which lodger had not eaten his breakfast 3 mornings in a row. She noticed which one came home later and later each week and started looking thinner through the face. She noticed which young woman had begun receiving letters with a particular postmark every Wednesday. And she drew her own quiet conclusions without saying a word. Mrs. Hudson, Watson noted, threw herself into violent hysterics when Sherlock Holmes returned from apparent death after 3 years. Not because he paid well, but because she had noticed for 3 years the empty rooms, the cold grates, the absence of that impossible man who had made her house feel, against all reason, like something was always happening inside it. The Victorian landlady noticed the life in her house, the way a gardener notices the state of every plant in a greenhouse. not with sentiment exactly, but with the particular attention of someone who understands that she is responsible for all of it, every single person under that roof, every single morning. Which brings us rather naturally to the morning itself, because the boarding house day did not begin at breakfast. It began long before the lodgers stirred. It began in the dark, in a cold kitchen, with a woman who had not slept quite enough, and still had to ensure that 8 or 10 strangers began their day feeling, if not exactly at home, then at least not entirely adrift. What that morning looked like, the fires, the food, the precise social choreography of getting a dozen people through a door and out into the city, is exactly where we are headed next. And I promise you, there is more going on at that breakfast table than any of the lodgers ever quite realized. Right. You have found the address. You have stood on the pavement for a moment, bag in hand, reading the small notice pasted to the inside of the downstairs window. Apartments to let, terms moderate. Inquire within. You knock, and this precise, unremarkable moment is the beginning of one of the most socially loaded encounters in the entire Victorian urban experience. Because stepping into a boarding house was not like checking into a hotel. It was not a transaction. It was, in every sense that mattered, an audition. Let me set the scene properly first, because the setting matters enormously here. The street itself would tell you something. Victorian boarding houses were concentrated in certain neighborhoods. Not the very finest, where great families kept their townhouses, but not the roughest either. They clustered in that wide middle ground. Bloomsbury in London, the streets around Manchester's commercial district, the respectable but slightly faded terraces of Edinburgh's New Town, the boarding avenues of Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. These were areas where the houses were solid brick built 4 or 5 stories tall, where the streets were paved and the windows had curtains and someone swept the front steps most mornings. Respectability was the whole point. It was the product being sold, more than the bed, more than the meals, and the moment the door opened, you were being assessed for whether you fit. Now, Cassell's Household Guide, the great Victorian domestic Bible, published in the 1880s, had very specific advice for lodgers about this first encounter. It said that a lodger should arrive with a clear sense of their requirements, state them plainly and without pretension, and be prepared to provide, when asked, a character reference. A character reference. Let that sink in for a moment. Before you could unpack a single shirt, before you'd seen your room, before you had any idea whether the mattress was tolerable or the wallpaper was the kind that made you slightly uneasy after dark, you had to prove to the satisfaction of a woman who had known you for approximately 4 minutes that you were a person of reliable character. This was not a formality. It was absolutely real. A respectable middle-class boarding house landlady would write to your previous employer, your clergyman, or a family acquaintance, whoever you had offered as your reference, and she would wait for the reply before she handed you a key. The writer Jerome K. Jerome, who spent a large portion of his early career moving through London boarding houses in the 1870s and 80s, recorded his experiences with a kind of fond exasperation. He described landladies who studied new arrivals with the focused intensity of a customs official searching for contraband, looking for small signs of unreliability. The slightly worn heel of a boot, the quality of the collar, the manner in which a man carried himself when he thought nobody was watching. Jerome, who went on to write the comic masterpiece 3 Men in a Boat, understood that the boarding house was its own kind of theater, and that you were expected to perform your social class convincingly from the very first second you crossed the threshold. So, you have passed the initial inspection. You've provided your references, stated your occupation, confirmed that you require bed and board, and perhaps use of the front parlor on Sunday evenings if convenient. You've agreed on the terms. Let us say 15 shillings a week, which in the 1870s would represent approximately 1/3 of what a junior clerk might earn in a decent City of London office. The landlady has shown you to your room, and now the real experience begins. What did that room actually look like? This is where I want to take a moment, because I think there is a gap between what we imagine and what the history tells us. And the gap is interesting. We tend to picture Victorian rooms as dark and oppressive, heavy drapes, furniture like ships run aground, wallpaper and patterns that seem to move slightly in the lamplight and are probably best not examined closely. And sometimes they were exactly that. But the boarding house bedroom of the 1870s was more often something considerably more modest. An iron bedstead with brass fittings, the standard recommendation of every Victorian domestic guide, from Mrs. Panton's Household Manual to Castle's Guide, was a brass and iron bed with a spring mattress and a proper hair mattress on top. Not the finest option, admittedly, but serviceable and crucially easier to keep clean than the old wooden four-posters that had harbored generations of bed bugs in their joints and crevices. A washstand. This is the detail that gets me every time. A wooden stand with a marble or painted top holding a ceramic jug and basin, a soap dish perhaps, a small sponge, and a single candle in a holder. This was your bathroom. Every morning, a servant, if the house ran to one, would bring up a jug of hot water. You would pour it into the basin, wash your face and hands, and consider yourself adequately prepared for the day. Full baths, if the house offered them at all, were typically available once a week and by arrangement. A portable hip bath might be carried to your room and filled by hand, a process involving multiple trips up the stairs with heavy jugs that the servant clearly did not relish, and that you were therefore expected to request sparingly, with appropriate gratitude. There would also be a looking glass, a small mirror, usually not large enough for a full view of yourself, which was perhaps just as well given the limited washing facilities, a wooden wardrobe or a set of pegs on the wall for clothes, a single chair, a small table, a fireplace which would be lit in cold weather at extra charge because coal was never included in the base rate if the landlady had anything to say about it. And the window, the position of your window, what it faced, what light it received, which floor it was on, said everything about your social position within the tiny, intensely legible hierarchy of the boarding house. Let me explain this because it is one of those details that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. In a Victorian boarding house, the floors were not equal. The ground floor rooms, parlor and front sitting room, were the most prestigious, the best lit, the largest. These were sometimes reserved for the landlady herself, or let only to the most senior, most well-paying lodgers. The first floor, what we would call the second floor in America, held the prime bedrooms. Higher ceilings, larger windows, better fireplaces. The lodger who paid the most lived here. Go up one more flight, and you were in the respectable middle. Decent rooms, adequate light, a window that faced either the street or the back garden, both of which had their particular advocates. The street meant noise and light draft, and the occasional shouted conversation from below at 1 in the morning. The garden meant quiet, damp mornings, the smell of someone's laundry, and the private knowledge that you could hear with perfect clarity every word spoken by the occupants of the ground floor kitchen. And then you reach the top floor, the third floor back. This is where things became genuinely Dickensian. Smaller rooms, lower ceilings, steeper stairs. In winter, the farthest possible distance from whatever heat the house generated. In summer, the closest possible proximity to a roof that absorbed the full force of an English August and radiated it downward with grim enthusiasm. The top floor back was where you lived if you were young, poor, and starting out, or if you were old, quiet, and had ceased to care. The novelist George Gissing, who spent years in London boarding houses in the 1880s and turned the experience into some of the sharpest social fiction of the Victorian era, described the symbolic weight of the upper floors with a precision that I think still lands today. To rise in a boarding house, he suggested, was not merely to get a better room. It was to announce to the whole assembled domestic society below that you had made something of yourself, that you were ascending, and everyone noticed. Now here is a question I genuinely want you to sit with for a moment, because it keeps coming back to me as I work through all of this. When was the last time you moved somewhere completely new and had to win the approval of strangers before you even unpacked? We have largely removed that experience from modern life. We sign a lease. We pay a deposit. We get a key. Nobody asks for our character reference. Nobody inspects the quality of our coat. And I wonder, honestly, I go back and forth on this, whether something was lost when we lost that process. Because the audition, exhausting as it was, also meant something else. It meant you were known. Within days of your arrival in a Victorian boarding house, the people around you had formed opinions about you. Real opinions based on observation. They had watched you at the table. They had noted whether you were punctual, whether you were courteous to the servant who brought your water, whether you left your door unlocked or bolted it every time you stepped out to the landing. Castle's guide put it bluntly. Lodgers should of course be models of regularity, quietness, and good order, and will usually find their account in it. Will find their account in it. Victorian understatement at its most eloquent. What it meant, translated into plain language, was this: behave yourself because everyone is watching, and the consequences of not behaving yourself will be swift, socially humiliating, and very difficult to reverse. There is a story, and I have read several versions of it in different accounts from the 1860s and 70s, about the particular terror of the boarding house notice. Not the advertisement outside the window. The other notice, the one that meant you had 1 week to find somewhere else to live. A week's notice could be given by either party, the landlady to the lodger, or the lodger to the landlady, for almost any reason or for no stated reason at all. It was the nuclear option of boarding house life, and it was used for coming home at 3 in the morning on 4 consecutive nights, for having an unexplained gentleman visitor on 2 separate Tuesdays for once. And I find this story almost unbearably relatable, for playing the piano after 10 in the evening when there was an invalid on the first floor who found the vibration distressing. The piano. The Victorians were absolutely rigid about the piano. Almost every account of boarding house social conflict involves the piano at some point. Who could play it, and when, whether the person currently playing it was competent enough to justify the imposition on everyone else. Whether the piece being played was appropriate for a Sunday, or too lively for a Tuesday, or so aggressively mediocre that it constituted a kind of auditory assault on anyone within earshot. Jerome K. Jerome has a passage about a fellow lodger's piano playing that I think could be published today and read as completely contemporary. He describes it with the precise, helpless suffering of a man who cannot say anything because saying anything would require a conversation, and the conversation would destroy the careful social equilibrium of a house in which everyone was already barely tolerating everyone else with magnificent Victorian effort. Which brings me to the thing about day one that nobody quite prepared the new lodger for. It was not the bed. It was not the fireplace, extra charges, or the smallness of the room, or the looking glass that showed you approximately a third of your own face. It was the other lodgers. You were going to encounter them almost immediately. That evening at supper, certainly, possibly in the hallway that afternoon if your arrival had been noted. And it had been noted, in a boarding house with 8 or 10 people, a new arrival was news. The historian Sharon Marcus, writing about Victorian domestic space, described the boarding house as a place that violated the Victorian domestic ideal because it brought within the walls of something claiming to be a home the unpredictability of the city streets. New faces, unknown histories, uncertain characters, and all of them, as of this evening, sharing your dining table. The question was not just what they thought of you. It was what they were actually like. The quiet man on the second floor who never spoke at supper. Was he simply private, or was there something more deliberate about his silence? The older woman at the far end of the table who watched everything with an expression of such composed interest that you could not decide whether she was friendly or simply cataloging your faults. The young man your own age who seemed on brief acquaintance to be either enormously confident or performing confidence so thoroughly that the distinction had ceased to matter. You were going to spend the next month, possibly the next year, eating, sleeping, and passing in narrow hallways with these people. And on day one, you knew almost nothing about any of them. Here is what strikes me about that situation every time I think about it carefully. We have an instinct looking back at the Victorian era to see the formality of it as a kind of emotional protection. As though all those rules and rituals, the references, the notice periods, the precise hierarchy of floors, the rigid observation of meal times, kept everyone at a safe, manageable distance. But I think it might have been the opposite. The formality was not distance. It was the structure that made closeness possible between people who would not otherwise have known how to manage it. Think about it. 8 strangers thrown together by economics and necessity who had to navigate shared space and shared meals without the moderating force of family, friendship, or prior acquaintance. The rules were not a wall. They were a grammar, a common language for people who did not yet share any other language. And on day one, sitting at that table for the first supper, watching the other faces in the gaslight, listening to the careful, performative conversation of people who were all simultaneously deciding how much of themselves to reveal. That grammar was the only thing between a household and the quiet, grinding social disaster of 8 people who could not figure out how to coexist. Which is why supper mattered so much more than just the food. And the food, the actual food that appeared on that table, who decided what it was, how much of it there was, what it told you about the financial health of the house and the ambitions of the landlady. That is exactly what we're going to dig into next. Because the Victorian boarding house dining table was its own entire universe, with politics and alliances and unspoken truces that would take us a solid hour to fully unpack. And I think by the time we're done, you're going to look at every shared meal you have ever eaten in a slightly different light. Somewhere in the middle of the 1870s, a writer named Thomas Butler Gunn sat down and produced one of the most entertainingly furious books ever written about American boarding house life. He called it The Physiology of New York Boarding Houses. And in it, he described the boarding house dining table with such precision, such barely contained outrage, and such detailed forensic attention to the precise temperature of the soup, the dimensions of the butter portions, and the exact technique by which a practiced landlady could serve 12 people what appeared to be a generous pot of stew, while actually feeding none of them quite enough, that I've been thinking about it ever since. Because Gunn was writing about New York in the 1850s, but everything he described, every single grievance, every social maneuver, every tactical deployment of the breadbasket, was happening simultaneously in London, Manchester, Edinburgh, and Boston. The boarding house dining table was a universal experience, and it was not comfortable. Let me describe the scene first, because you need to be able to picture it clearly. The dining room was, in most boarding houses, the most important room in the building. Not the most comfortable, not the most elegant, but the most important, in the way that a stage is important because everything that mattered about the social life of the house happened here twice a day, whether the participants wanted it to or not. The table itself was long enough to seat 8 or 10 people with varying degrees of elbow room, depending on how many the house was running at full capacity. It was covered with a tablecloth, usually white, frequently showing in the bright morning light the evidence of last night's dinner that the wash had not entirely removed. At one end sat the landlady. This is important. The landlady did not simply oversee the table from a distance. She sat at it. She presided. She controlled from her position at the head the distribution of food, the pace of service, the temperature of the social atmosphere, and in ways that were sometimes obvious and sometimes entirely invisible, the relative comfort of every person present. At the other end sat whoever among the lodgers had by seniority, good behavior, or sheer force of personality claimed the informal second position. This was rarely agreed upon explicitly. It simply emerged over the first few weeks of any new configuration of lodgers through a process of social negotiation that everyone participated in and nobody acknowledged. Now the food. The Victorian boarding house breakfast was a serious affair. In the respectable middle-class house, you could expect on a good morning broiled haddock or kippers, or perhaps both. Eggs, either boiled or poached, depending on the cook's mood and ability. Cold meat from last night's dinner for those who wanted it. Bread, butter, and preserves. Tea or coffee served from a pot that began its journey from the kitchen at a temperature that suggested genuine ambition and arrived at the table at a temperature that suggested the kitchen was further away than anyone had accounted for. The prices at a respectable City of London boarding house in the 1870s, and these are documented figures recorded in a Victorian guide to London lodgings, were approximately 3 shillings for bed and breakfast, with dinner running to an additional 2 shillings for a chop or a steak. Tea with a chop was 1 shilling and 6 pence. Tea without a chop was 1 shilling. What those numbers tell you, if you study them long enough, is that the economics of the boarding house table were calibrated to the absolute last halfpenny. Every item had a price, every extra, an additional egg, a second helping of bread, the small pot of marmalade that appeared on the table at breakfast and mysteriously reappeared at every breakfast for a fortnight until somebody finally ate it, was accounted for somewhere in the landlady's mental ledger. Dinner was the main event. In most boarding houses, dinner was served in the early evening around 5 or 6 o'clock for working households, later in the houses that catered to a more leisurely set. And here the class politics of the table became visible in a way that even the most careful social tactician could not entirely manage. There was a phrase in Victorian America that I love with my whole heart: the boarding house reach. It referred to the particular practiced move of a long-term lodger leaning far across the table, arm fully extended, claiming the best piece of whatever was on the communal dish before anyone else could get to it. The food was placed in the center of the table, and everyone served themselves or served each other in a performance of politeness that could run either direction. Genuine generosity, or the kind of aggressive courtesy by which you secured your own portion while appearing to prioritize someone else's. The boarding house reach was a survival skill. It was also considered by anyone who did it conspicuously absolutely mortifying. The etiquette guides of the 1880s were emphatic on this point. One should never appear to scramble for food. One should wait, serve the lady seated nearest, and take whatever remained with every appearance of contentment. In practice, of course, those who waited often got the boiled turnips, while those who reached got the mutton. And so the table was every evening the site of a small, elaborate, silent war between what Victorian society demanded people appear to be and what Victorian boarding house economics actually required of them. Here is something I want to sit with for a moment, because I think it is genuinely overlooked in most accounts of Victorian domestic life. The food in a boarding house was not always bad. It was sometimes very good, depending on the landlady's skill and financial position. But it was almost always the same. The mid-Victorian boarding house worked on a rotation of dishes that any lodger who stayed more than 2 weeks could predict with the precision of a railway timetable. Sunday was the anchor. Sunday dinner was the best meal of the week. A boiled joint, usually mutton or beef, sometimes pork, with potatoes and whatever vegetables were in season, and perhaps a pudding for those houses that ran to that sort of thing. Monday's dinner was yesterday's joint, served cold with potatoes and pickles. Tuesday, a stew made from whatever remained of the joint, extended with onions and carrots, and served thickened with a little flour in a sauce that was described as gravy and that bore a relation to gravy approximately as close as a drawing of a horse bears to the actual horse. Wednesday, something involving potatoes, possibly alone. Thursday, fish if the house was good. If the house was less good, Thursday was the day you seriously considered whether you might prefer to eat at the chop house down the street and simply charge it to your own conscience. Friday, fish again, or soup. The soup in boarding houses of uncertain quality was a particular subject of lodger folklore. It was described in various accounts from the period as thin, as suspiciously colored, as containing textures that defied identification, and as having a temperature range of anywhere from nearly hot to actively cold in a way that suggested it had met the kitchen fire only briefly and on poor terms. Brown Windsor soup, the specific variety associated with boarding house culture, became so notorious in its combination of pretentious name and questionable contents that one Victorian food historian described it as a soup largely associated with shabby boarding houses trying to sound posh, which I find both perfectly accurate and deeply, deeply funny. But here's what the food was actually about. The food was not only nutrition, the food was information. A breakfast that arrived punctually at the same time each morning, hot, adequately portioned, served without comment, told you something about the financial health of the house. It told you the landlady was solvent, that the coal merchant was still being paid, that the cook, if there was a cook, had not quit in the night. A breakfast that arrived late, lukewarm, with the bread slightly stale and the butter in quantities that suggested it had been rationed with a teaspoon, told you something else entirely. It told you the house was in difficulty. It told you to check whether the week's rent was about to become a negotiation rather than a simple transaction. Long-term lodgers became extraordinarily skilled at reading these signs. They watched the tablecloth, a slightly yellowed tablecloth, still crisp on Monday morning, but showing by Thursday the archaeology of the week's meals. That was the tablecloth of a house managing adequately. A tablecloth that appeared on Monday, already soft and limp and bearing stains that had outlived multiple washes. That was the tablecloth of a house in difficulty. They watched the butter dish. The butter dish in Victorian boarding house law occupied approximately the position that the canary did in a coal mine. Its contents told you everything worth knowing about where the house stood this particular week. And then there was the conversation. Victorian dining etiquette was extremely clear about what should and should not be discussed at table. The Guide, Our Deportment, published in 1882, stated with great authority that for one or two persons to monopolize a conversation which ought to be general is exceedingly rude. Letters, newspapers, and books should never be brought to the table. Heated debates on religion or politics were firmly discouraged. The tone was to be pleasant, the subjects light, the conversation a gentle social lubricant that allowed 8 strangers to spend 45 minutes in proximity without anyone saying something that could not be taken back. In practice, the boarding house table produced conversations that were some of the most exquisitely tense in Victorian social life, because the people sitting at that table were not in fact a collection of socially matched individuals whose paths had crossed through choice. They were an accident of economics. Sitting around the same board, you might find a retired army officer who had strong opinions about the current government and no particular inhibitions about sharing them. A young schoolteacher who held opposing opinions with equal fervor, but had been raised to believe that expressing them at table was unseemly. A traveling salesman, a bagman in the Victorian phrase, who had told the same 3 stories so many times that the other lodgers could deliver them from memory, but had not yet informed him of this fact. A widow of middle years who maintained a silence, so profound and so carefully calibrated that it had become over the weeks its own kind of statement. You might wonder, what did they talk about? The weather, primarily. The news, cautiously in vague terms, watching who agreed and who did not. Work, in very general terms, because being too specific about one's occupation was either boasting or confession, depending on the occupation. Local events. The food itself, always with careful surgical ambiguity, so that a complaint about the soup could be phrased, if necessary, as an observation that soup was so very dependent on the cook's mood. Was it not? The landlady received these observations with an expression that conveyed nothing. She'd heard them all before. She would hear them again. She was not in any meaningful sense personally wounded by a comment about the temperature of the soup, but she remembered who had made it, and she filed that information away in the same mental ledger where she kept the coal expenditure and the weekly bread account. There is a particular dynamic that I think about sometimes when I consider the Victorian boarding house table, and I think it maps onto something recognizable in modern life. Think about shared office kitchens. Think about the communal refrigerator and the person who eats other people's labeled lunches, and the passive-aggressive note that appears on the microwave, and the elaborate social contract that governs how long you are permitted to stand in front of the coffee machine before someone behind you begins to radiate in meaningful impatience. None of this was invented in the 20th century. We just moved it to a different room. The Victorian boarding house table was the original shared kitchen, and the politics that governed it were, in their essential nature, exactly the same. The management of limited resources among people who had not chosen each other, under social rules designed to prevent any individual grievance from becoming a crisis that disrupted the functioning of the whole. I want to tell you about one specific practice at the Victorian table that I think is the perfect illustration of how all of this worked, or rather, how it was supposed to work and occasionally spectacularly did not. The seating plan. In a well-managed boarding house, the landlady decided who sat where. This was not arbitrary. It was in fact one of the most politically significant decisions she made each week. The etiquette guides of the period, dressers, the various domestic manuals, all agree that a good host places guests so that their qualities complement rather than clash. A good talker in the center, where all can hear him. Not two people of the same profession beside each other, for they would fall into exclusive conversation. The timid and the confident well distributed around the table. In the boarding house, this principle operated on a different axis. The landlady seated her most reliable payers near her, where she could keep them close. She seated new arrivals at the far end, where they could be observed before being trusted with proximity. She moved people gradually over weeks and months as her assessment of them refined itself. The lodger who found herself moved one Monday morning from the middle of the table to a seat closer to the landlady understood, without a word being spoken, that something had changed in how she was regarded. And the lodger who found himself, without warning or explanation, resettled at the far end of the table near the draft from the kitchen door. He knew with cold certainty that he had done something, or failed to do something, and that the recovery, if recovery was possible at all, was going to require very careful work. The boarding house table was many things at once. It was where people were fed. It was where they were judged. It was where alliances were formed over shared exasperation about the soup, and where quiet, durable antagonisms were born over a seat that had been taken too many times, or a dish that had been served 3 weeks running without any apparent awareness that it had been served twice before. And it was where sometimes something genuinely beautiful happened. Because occasionally, not always, not reliably, but occasionally, a table full of strangers became over months of mutual endurance something that resembled a community, not a family. The Victorians were careful about that word. The boarding house was not a family, and everyone at the table knew it. But something, a group of people who shared the same tablecloth on Sunday, who had heard each other's limited conversational repertoire until they could predict the next sentence, who had noticed each other's absences and been, in some cases, quietly, unexpectedly concerned. The sociologist might call it an involuntary community. The Victorian might call it simply a house. But whatever you call it, it mattered. It mattered to the young clerk who had no one else in this city. It mattered to the widow at the far end of the table who said almost nothing at dinner, but who, when a new lodger arrived in winter looking thin and cold, passed the bread basket across without being asked and looked at nothing in particular while she did it. It mattered. And if the dining room was the public stage of boarding house life, the place where people performed their social selves with great care and moderate success, then there was another room in the house where no such performance was possible: the bedroom. And what happened behind those thin walls in those small rooms in the hours between when the table was cleared and when the house came back to life in the morning, that is a story worth telling on its own. Because the Victorian boarding house bedroom was not simply a place to sleep. It was the only private space most lodgers had in the world. And in a house full of strangers, the things people kept in that space, the things they hid, the things they could not help revealing, the things that seeped through the walls whether they wanted them to or not, those are the things that tell you who Victorian people actually were when nobody at the dining table was watching. Something shifts when the dining room empties. The plates go back to the kitchen. The conversation dissolves into the evening air. The gas lamps are turned lower, one by one, until the hallway is just a long tube of amber shadow, and the house begins to breathe differently, slower, quieter. The particular quiet of a building full of people trying not to be heard. You climb the stairs, and when that door closes behind you, something rather remarkable happens. For the first time since morning, you are completely alone. There is a sentence that has stayed with me since I first read it in the work of historian Judith Flanders, who spent years reconstructing the interior lives of Victorian households. She wrote that the bedroom in a Victorian home was the room where the self was permitted to exist without an audience. In the parlor you performed, at the dining table you negotiated, in the hallway you managed, but in the bedroom, that 12 by 10 foot rectangle of iron and plaster and faded carpet, you were briefly yourself. For a boarding house lodger, that distinction was not abstract. It was the entire psychological survival of the experience. Let us take stock of what you actually had in that room. The iron bedstead with brass knobs at the corners, a horsehair mattress on top of a straw one. The hierarchy of comfort encoded right there in the layers. 3 pairs of sheets was the standard recommendation for any decent house. Though how recently these particular sheets had been laundered was a matter of some delicacy that Castle's household guide addressed with the diplomacy of a foreign minister. It suggested carefully that lodgers should ask. A washstand, the candle, a wardrobe or a set of pegs. No clothes hangers yet. Those were not in general use until the turn of the century. A looking glass small enough to show you only a portion of your own face at any one time, which may have been intentional. A window facing whichever direction the architecture allowed. And under the bed, the chamber pot. This is not a small detail. In a house with no indoor plumbing, and most Victorian boarding houses had none, even as late as the 1880s, the chamber pot was not a quaint antique. It was a practical necessity that shaped the rhythm of your night and required every morning a quiet and specific form of domestic reckoning that nobody at the breakfast table ever mentioned. Here is where I want to pause for a moment, because this is the part of the story where I think modern people most profoundly misread the Victorian experience of private space. We tend to assume that having a room to yourself meant having privacy. It did not. Not in any meaningful sense. The walls of a Victorian boarding house were not thick. They were lath and plaster. Essentially compressed dust and horsehair stretched between thin wooden slats. And what passed through them was not merely sound, but the entire acoustic texture of another person's private life. You heard the man next door cough. You heard him pace at 2 in the morning. You heard, on certain nights, the sound of someone crying with a restraint so practiced that it was clear they had been doing it quietly for a long time. The historian Vicky Holmes, whose research on Victorian lodging arrangements draws from hundreds of coroners' inquest records and contemporary newspaper accounts, describes the boarding house bedroom as a space of radical and voluntary intimacy. A place where people knew far more about their neighbors than any formal social relationship between them could account for. You knew the pattern of their insomnia. You knew when they had received a letter that disturbed them, because the pacing told you before they did. You knew the specific quality of someone else's silence that meant they were awake and thinking about something difficult. And they knew all the same things about you. This was never spoken of. It was simply known. The bed bugs were a different kind of intimacy altogether. I've been trying to think of a delicate way to address this and have decided there is none. So let us simply proceed. The Victorian boarding house bed bug problem was not a fringe concern. It was a central, documented, ubiquitous feature of life in almost every category of boarding house, from the genteel to the rough. The bed bugs loved ornate furniture. They nested in the carved wooden joints of beds, in the folds of upholstered headboards, in the seams of horsehair mattresses. A Victorian mattress was, from the perspective of a bed bug, essentially a luxury apartment building. The 1863 edition of a popular American household guide, Miss Leslie's Lady's House book, warned directly that, when moving into an old house with various occupants, these insects frequently made their appearance. Not might, frequently. Thomas Carlyle's wife, Jane Welsh Carlyle, left a vivid account of her own encounter with them that reads, 200 years later, as completely contemporary in its exasperation. She flung 20 pailfuls of water on the kitchen floor, killed every bug she could find, steeped the pieces of the bed in a tub of water in the garden for 2 days, painted all the joints, had the curtains washed, and then, exhausted and furious, hoped and trusted there was not one escaped alive to tell the tale. Jane Carlyle was not a lodger. She was the mistress of her own house. Imagine then the position of the boarding house lodger, who had no authority over the furniture, no ability to order the bed steeped in the garden, and no means of addressing the problem without implying that the landlady's house was infested, which was true, but socially impossible to say. Experienced Victorian travelers learned certain tricks. One account from the 1870s suggests pulling the bed away from the wall and placing each leg in a shallow dish of oil. The bugs apparently could not cross it. Whether this actually worked or whether it simply gave the lodger the psychologically necessary feeling of having done something is a question that history does not entirely resolve. What I find genuinely moving about the boarding house bedroom, and I mean that without irony, is not the bed bugs or the thin walls or the chamber pot. It is what people brought into those rooms from their former lives. Because here is the thing that the historical record reveals. If you look closely enough, people did not live in their boarding house rooms as if they were temporary. They made them theirs, not in the manner of someone settling permanently. No major redecoration, no installation of personal furniture, but in the quieter, more provisional way of someone who understands that a space you occupy is a space you inhabit. And inhabiting a space means leaving some trace of yourself in it. A shelf by the bed for a book. Some photographs or engravings placed on the mantelpiece. A small ornament from home. The kind of object that has no particular value, and therefore no explanation, and therefore never needs to be explained to anyone. Victorian domestic guides of the 1880s were oddly specific about this kind of bedroom personalization. They recommended photographs and engravings. They discussed small brackets for china ornaments, warning with some feeling against china twisted into outlandish forms such as dolphins, frogs, or small pink dogs. I find it impossible to read that particular warning without wondering who specifically prompted it. Someone, somewhere in the 1880s, had a small pink china dog on their bedroom shelf, and an etiquette writer who disapproved. The small pink dog stayed, I hope. Now, and this is the part of the bedroom story that I think matters most, people wrote letters in these rooms. The Victorian era was, by any measure, the golden age of personal correspondence. The penny post had made letter writing cheap. The expanding railway network made it reliable. And in a world without telephones, without any form of instant communication, the letter was the only thread that connected a young man in a London boarding house to his mother in Yorkshire, or a young woman in Manchester to a sister who had married and moved to a market town 40 miles away. The bedroom was where these letters were written, at the small table, sometimes just the corner of the washstand, which the household manuals anxiously noted was being used for ink when it was meant for water. The lodger would sit in the hour before the candle needed to be extinguished and write. What did they write about? We have some of these letters. Not many, not nearly enough, but some. They wrote about the food, which was almost always described in terms that mixed careful diplomacy with suppressed distress. They wrote about the weather, which was always worse than remembered. They wrote about the work, which was either better or worse than hoped. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, they wrote about the house itself, about the landlady in careful language that acknowledged she was likely to see the letter at some point if left carelessly on the table, about the other lodgers described in the kind of precise shorthand that people develop for the characters in their immediate orbit. The man across the hall who sang while he dressed in the morning and had an astonishing repertoire, but no sense of appropriate hour. The old lady at the end of the corridor who knocked on doors at unexpected moments offering items of food and refusing to acknowledge any awkwardness in this. These letters are, in my view, the closest thing we have to a direct account of what it actually felt like to live in these rooms. Not the formal complaints, not the satirist exaggerations. The quiet, honest, slightly tired voice of someone who has had a long week and is writing by candlelight because writing is the only way they have of being fully themselves in a house full of strangers. Can I ask you something? Have you ever lived somewhere temporary? A student dormitory, perhaps, or a short-term rental, or a place you knew from the first night was not going to be permanent, and found yourself, against your better judgment, making it yours anyway? Hanging something on the wall, arranging your books in a particular order, placing something on the windowsill that served no practical purpose except to mark the space as having been occupied by you specifically. I think most of us have done this, and I think most of us understand, without being able to say exactly why, that it matters. The Victorian lodger understood it too. That small photograph on the mantelpiece, that book placed spine out on the shelf, that particular candle in the holder bought from the chandler's shop on the corner rather than the cheaper ones the landlady provided. All of it said the same thing. I am here. I am a person who exists when nobody is watching. This room, for the time being, is mine. But here is the last thing I want to tell you about the Victorian boarding house bedroom. And it is, I think, the most unexpectedly human thing in this entire story. There is evidence in various accounts and inquest records, examined by researchers like Vicky Holmes, that lodgers in working-class households sometimes slept not just near their hosts, but genuinely among them, sharing rooms, occasionally sharing beds, particularly in winter. This was not considered scandalous in these households. It was considered practical. It was considered, in some cases, the middle-class coroner encountering such arrangements in formal proceedings was often visibly appalled. The people who actually lived this way were not, because the boarding house in its many forms, the respectable Bloomsbury townhouse, the cheap Manchester Doss, the working-class terrace street where a lodger shared the bedroom with 3 children and a grandmother, was not ultimately about the walls between people. It was about what happened across those walls, the sounds that passed through them, the knowledge they accumulated slowly and involuntarily of what it was actually like to be another person trying to sleep in a city that never entirely stopped. Every night in a boarding house bedroom was an act of small faith. That the house was safe, that the person next door was not too troubled tonight, that the candle would last until the letter was finished, that the morning would come and the routine would hold and another day could be managed. And the other lodgers, the ones you passed in the hall and ate with in silence and heard through the walls, they were doing exactly the same thing, which is, I suppose, as close as strangers ever come to actually knowing each other. And yet the strangers were not only strangers. Inside those rooms, beyond those walls, beyond the carefully maintained surface of boarding house propriety, there were people. People with histories that the dining room table would never fully contain. Characters so specific, so strange, so entirely themselves that sharing a house with them for even 1 month could change how you saw the world. The clerk who never spoke at supper. The woman who watched everything. The man who arrived in November with too much luggage for someone planning to stay only a month. Who were they really? That is exactly where we are going next. Charles Dickens understood something about boarding houses that most of his contemporaries could not quite articulate. He wrote about them twice. Once in his very first book, the collection of sketches published under the pen name Boz in the 1830s, and again, more masterfully, years later in Martin Chuzzlewit, where the establishment run by Mrs. Todgers remains one of the most precisely observed rooming houses in all of English fiction. What Dickens saw, what he captured with that forensic, slightly unsettling attention that made him both loved and feared as a social observer, was that a boarding house was above everything else, a collection of human beings who had arrived from different directions and had not chosen each other. And that this unchosenness was the whole point, because families choose each other more or less. Friends definitely choose each other. But the 8 people around a boarding house table on a Tuesday evening in November, they are together for one reason only. They all needed a room, and this room was available. Out of that single shared circumstance, something happened that Dickens found endlessly fascinating. People in all their glorious, maddening, specific, unrepeatable individuality. Let me tell you who was actually in these houses. The census records, the court proceedings, the newspaper notices, the boarding house directories from Philadelphia, London, Manchester, Boston, all of them, when you read them closely enough, start to produce something unexpected. Not statistics, not categories, people. In one documented house on Cooper Street in Camden, New Jersey, in the year 1880, a single building accommodated a young couple with an infant daughter, a middle-aged widower, a family of 7 with grown children, a grandfather with his teenage granddaughter, a widow with her 19-year-old son, and a middle-aged couple who had arrived from Germany the previous year and were learning English as fast as circumstances permitted. Among them, a bricklayer, a watchman, an elocutionist in a working-class boarding house in New Jersey, a salesman, a dyer, a grocer, and a man whose occupation the census taker had recorded as simply laborer, which in 1880 covered an enormous range of both work and exhaustion. That house was not exceptional. That house was Tuesday. Now, among all the types who passed through Victorian boarding houses, there were certain recurring figures, characters so consistent across the literature, the records, and the social commentary that they might as well have been archetypes. The first is the one most written about, the clerk. In the 1870s and 80s, the explosion of commercial activity in Britain and America had produced a vast new class of young men, office workers, counting house employees, junior administrators, who earn enough to keep themselves respectable, but not enough to do it comfortably. A City of London clerk in the 1870s might earn somewhere between 70 and 120 pounds a year, depending on his seniority and the generosity of his employer. This sounds, if you do not know the period, like it might be adequate. It was not adequate. After rent, and we've established what rent looked like. After food. After clothing that had to be kept in sufficient condition to be worn to an office where appearances counted. After the cost of transport, there was almost nothing. And the boarding house clerk knew this. He performed his social class every day with the precision of an actor who cannot afford to be caught in the wings. At the table he conversed about general topics. He read the newspaper with the focused attention of someone who needed to be informed but could not afford to have opinions that might cause awkwardness. He had ambitions. Almost certainly he had ambitions. He was working towards something, promotion perhaps, or eventually a position that would allow him to leave the boarding house and establish something more permanent. George Gissing, writing from his own experience of boarding house life in the 1880s in the novel New Grub Street, described the particular ache of that in-between position. The young educated man who can see very clearly the life he wants and is separated from it by a distance that is almost entirely composed of money and the stubborn passage of time. The boarding house was where you waited. The clerk knew that, and the knowledge gave him a specific quality, a kind of watchful patience that could be mistaken for contentment but was on closer inspection, something much more carefully maintained. Then there was the widow, not the landlady. That is a different story, and we have already spent time there. The other widow, the lodger who was also a widow. She appeared with enough regularity to be considered a fixed feature in almost every account of boarding house life from the 1850s onward. A guide to London lodgings published in Crustley's Handbook for 1865 observed with characteristic Victorian bluntness that boarding houses always contained a larger mixture of people there for society, and that of this group a considerable proportion was sure to consist of widows or spinsters of extremely marriageable tendencies. The phrasing is entertaining. The reality behind it is considerably more serious. Victorian widowhood for a woman without independent means was a specific and genuinely precarious position. She had lost her primary financial support. She was too old in many cases for domestic service. She had no professional qualifications. The era had seen to that. And she was too proud in many more cases than the statistics suggest to ask for help from family members who had their own difficulties. So she went to the boarding house. She took a smaller room than she was accustomed to. She brought with her usually a few good pieces of furniture, items her landlady would recognize as evidence of a better past, and she installed herself with as much dignity as the circumstances permitted. At table she contributed to conversation carefully. She was, in many accounts, one of the most acute observers in the house, because women of her generation had spent their entire lives in the particular school of social intelligence that consisted of understanding other people without appearing to pay them any obvious attention. She noticed the clerk's fraying cuffs before he did. She noticed which lodger had received bad news that week and needed the bread basket passed across without comment. She noticed when the cook had been replaced and said nothing, and adjusted her expectations of dinner accordingly. There is a woman named Catherine Thorne who appears briefly in the historical research of Wendy Gamber. At the age of 78, following the death of her husband, she moved into a boarding house. She stayed there until her death at 89, 11 years in a boarding house, 11 years at the communal table, 11 years of dinners and conversations and new arrivals and quiet departures, and all the accumulated texture of living among strangers who became over time something that was not quite family, but was not nothing either. I find Catherine Thorne's 11 years the most quietly remarkable fact in this entire story. The third figure is the one who interested Dickens most, and who interested the reformers most for different reasons. The drifter. Not a criminal necessarily, not poor enough for the common lodging houses at the bottom of the scale, just unattached. In Dickens's first boarding house sketches, the character he calls the bagman, the commercial traveler, the salesman who was always between places, always arriving and departing, is described as someone who adds to the house a quality of permanent impermanence. He brings news. He brings a certain energy. He also brings the particular social disruption of someone who does not need to maintain relationships with anyone in the house beyond the length of his current stay. The bagman could be rude at breakfast, because he would be gone by Thursday. The permanent lodger could not afford that luxury. Joseph O'Neill, whose research into the Victorian lodging house drew on hundreds of newspaper accounts and court records, described the drifters who passed through these places as living in a twilight realm, neither at home nor settled away from home. That phrase lodged in my mind when I first read it. A twilight realm. Not darkness, not light. The particular quality of a life lived between things. Between the place you came from and the place you were heading toward, between the person you had been and the person you were still becoming. And the boarding house was where you lived while all of that was being sorted out. But there was a fourth type, and this one is the most fascinating of all. The man or the woman with no name, or rather with a name and very little else. Every boarding house had at least one of them. The lodger who had been there when current residents arrived and would apparently be there when they left, who offered nothing of their history beyond what could be inferred from surfaces, the quality of a coat, the way they held a knife, whether they spoke to the newspaper or the newspaper spoke to them. In Dickens's boarding house sketch, one character is described as someone perceived to be a gentleman and undoubtedly occupying the first floor. He is punctual, quiet, eligible as an inmate. Beyond that, nothing. The lodgers knew his breakfast order by heart. They did not know his first name. They did not know where he went when he left the house every morning, and returned exactly at 4 to 6. They did not know what he was thinking as he sat at the table in that particular careful silence of his. And here's the thing, they did not ask. Because one of the great unspoken agreements of boarding house life was that you were entitled to be exactly as mysterious as you chose to be. Nobody owed the house an explanation. Nobody was required to account for their Monday evenings, or their particular fondness for a certain window seat, or the reason they sometimes skipped dinner without notice and came down for breakfast the next morning looking as though they had slept somewhere else. The boarding house was, in this sense, a profoundly modern institution. It was one of the only spaces in Victorian urban life where a person could maintain anonymity without being suspected of anything in particular, where the simple fact of paying your rent on time bought you the right to be opaque. Now I want to tell you about a real house, not a fictional one, not a reconstruction, a real address in Boston, Massachusetts in the 1880s. The Harrison Gray Otis House on Cambridge Street, a federal-style mansion built in the late 18th century that had, by the mid-19th century, been converted into a boarding house. Its records, such as they survive, show a procession of lodgers over the decades that reads like a Victorian novel. If someone had decided to write a Victorian novel that told the truth about who actually lived in cities rather than who made the best narrative subjects. Naval officers, physicians, newspaper editors, clerks. A widow named Mrs. George Punchett, whose husband had founded the Boston Daily Evening Traveler. A man of 57 named Francis Merrick, who had spent his entire working life as a clerk at the Boston Navy Yard, listed in the census records with a flatness that contains the entirety of an ordinary human life. Francis Merrick, age 57, clerk. No adjectives, no embellishment. Just a man who had worked his whole life at the same desk and was living in his late middle age in a boarding house where someone else made the meals and aired the linens, and he could sit by the window in the evenings with whatever it was that Francis Merrick, age 57, thought about. What strikes me about all of these people? The clerk with the fraying cuffs, the widow with the good furniture, the drifter who was gone by Thursday, the quiet man in the first floor rooms, is that the boarding house asked something of all of them that almost nowhere else in Victorian life asked. It asked them to be civil to people they had not chosen, day after day, meal after meal, to pass the bread to someone whose politics they found objectionable, to maintain a pleasant expression in the presence of someone who hummed during their morning ablutions in a way that by the third week had become genuinely personal. And most of them, not all but most, managed it because the alternative was not some idealized privacy. The alternative was the street, or the doss house, or a loneliness so complete that it made even the most taxing boarding house dinner preferable by a significant margin. Here is a question I keep circling back to. Do you think you would have been good at this? Genuinely. If you had lived in a boarding house for a year, sharing your meals with 8 strangers, navigating the table, the hallways, the thin walls, and the unspoken agreements, do you think you would have found it unbearable? Or do you think, once you settled in, once you knew the routine and understood the grammar of the place, you might have found something in it? I ask because I honestly do not know what my own answer is. Part of me thinks the enforced company would have been unbearable. Part of me, the part that lives in a world of very effective solitude and sometimes misses the accidental intimacy of shared spaces, thinks Catherine Thorne's 11 years might have had something to them that we have lost in our beautifully private, very quiet apartments. There were, of course, those among the lodgers who did not behave civilly, who brought to the table not patience and tact, but the specific social energies of people who had not been told in enough time and in clear enough terms that certain things were simply not done in a boarding house. The unwritten rules, every house had them. Some of them were sensible. Some of them were inexplicable. All of them were absolute. And the consequences of breaking them, the social machinery that activated when someone crossed a line in the invisible code that governed boarding house life, those are well worth examining in their own right. Because nothing reveals a community's values quite so clearly as what happens when someone violates them. Every community has rules, Families have rules. Offices have rules. Entire nations have rules inscribed in documents and enforced by institutions and discussed at length in the kind of meetings where someone has brought sandwiches and nobody's happy about the sandwiches. But the most powerful rules, the ones that really shape how people behave, the ones with real teeth, are the ones that nobody wrote down. The Victorian boarding house had an enormous number of those, and breaking them was not technically illegal. Nobody would arrest you. Nobody would fine you. But in a boarding house, the social consequences of a serious rule violation could be swift, humiliating, and final. You would be out on the street with your bag by Friday, and the landlady would look entirely calm about it. Let me start with the rule that underpinned everything else, the rule of appearances. In the Victorian boarding house, and this applied with equal force to the respectable houses of London's Bloomsbury as to the fashionable boarding avenues of Boston. What you appeared to be was socially what you were, not what you actually were. What you appeared to be, a Victorian guide to London lodgings, published in the 1860s, described the boarding houses available to the respectable classes as running from those devoted to entertainment of minor city clerks, rigorously engaged during the day, to those in which nobody under the rank of a baronet was received, and even then not without a reference as to respectability on the part of a peer. That phrase, a reference as to respectability on the part of a peer, is doing enormous work there. It means, before you enter this house, someone above you in the social hierarchy must vouch for the fact that you can be trusted to maintain appearances. And once you were in the house, you maintained them every day without exception. This meant appearing at table properly dressed. Not formally, this was not a grand hotel, but correctly, coat and collar for the men, respectable dress, appropriately fastened for the women. Coming downstairs in a state of undress, even partially, even just to retrieve something quickly from a hall table, was the kind of thing that got mentioned, not loudly, not confrontationally, just mentioned in the tone of voice that conveyed a considerable volume of social information in a very small number of words. Castle's Household Guide, the great domestic Bible of the 1880s, was explicit on one related point that I find genuinely fascinating. It stated that the latch key, the key that allowed a lodger to enter the house, at whatever hour they returned in the evening, was to be granted only to lodgers who had provided respectable references, not given automatically, earned. And in some houses, the latchkey was the single most important marker of a lodger's social standing within the house. The lodger with a latchkey had been judged trustworthy. The lodger who still had to ring the bell at whatever hour they returned was, every time they rang, reminded of their provisional status. The second rule was about time. Victorian boarding houses ran on time the way a railway ran on time, with the understanding that the whole system worked only if every individual component held to the schedule. Meals at specific hours, not approximate hours, the hour. Castle's guide was unambiguous on this point, too. Lodgers should, it said, be models of regularity. The lodger who arrived at the table after it had been served was not merely inconveniencing the cook. They were disrupting the entire social order of the meal. They were making everyone else wait, or begin without them, either of which was socially awkward in its own particular way. In houses where the landlady presided with real authority, arriving consistently late for meals was an offense that escalated over weeks, from quietly noted to openly discussed, to the subject of a private conversation in which the landlady stated with finality that a house ran on certain principles which she trusted would prove mutually satisfactory, which was the Victorian way of saying, be on time or find somewhere else. The rhythm of the house was its identity. Early morning, the water brought upstairs. Breakfast at 8. The house emptied by 9 as the working lodgers departed. Dinner in the early evening. The house quiet by 10, disrupting this rhythm. Coming home noisily at midnight, sending the kitchen into disarray by requesting food at irregular hours. Waking the house with sounds that belonged to much later was not just inconvenient. It was a statement. It said, "I do not consider your rhythm as binding on me." And in a house where shared space was the only space everyone had, that statement was serious. The third rule is the one that caused by far the most actual drama, the rule about visitors. Who you brought to the house, and when, and for how long. This was a subject of extraordinary sensitivity in the Victorian boarding house, and the rules around it were both explicit and entirely unspoken, which is exactly as contradictory as it sounds. The explicit rule was simple enough. Visitors were to be received in the parlor or the sitting room, never in a lodger's private rooms, except under circumstances that had been specifically arranged with the landlady and that everyone understood were exceptional and temporary. This rule existed in theory to protect the privacy of other lodgers and the reputation of the house. In practice, it existed because the landlady needed to know who was coming into her house. A male visitor for a female lodger was a matter requiring careful management. Not impossible, not forbidden necessarily, but managed. He was to be received in a shared room, in the presence of the household, and he was to depart at a reasonable hour. An unannounced male visitor appearing at a woman's door after dark was the kind of thing that, if the landlady had any opinion about her house's reputation at all, resulted in a conversation the following morning that nobody was going to enjoy. And yet this is the part of the rule that I find genuinely interesting to think about, because the Victorian boarding house was, as the historian Sharon Marcus noted, a space that violated the domestic ideal, one that brought the unpredictability of the city streets inside the walls of something that called itself a home. It was not, despite all the rules, a sealed environment. People came and went. Visitors arrived. Some of them stayed longer than they should have. Some of them arrived repeatedly on days when no one was supposed to notice, by routes that involved the back stairs and the kitchen door, and a level of determination that suggested considerable feeling. The boarding house, for all its insistence on respectability, was also a place where certain freedoms existed precisely because the rules were maintained with such visible rigor. The Victorians understood this perfectly. What the rules actually provided was not the prevention of complexity. They provided the structure within which complexity could exist without becoming chaos. Now, let me tell you about some of the rules that were so obvious that nobody wrote them down, and which were therefore, for the newcomer, entirely invisible until they were violated. The rule of the armchair. Every boarding house parlor had at least one best chair, or one prime position near the fire, or one particular corner of the sofa that belonged, through long and uncontested occupation, to a specific lodger. Not formally assigned, not discussed, but absolutely claimed, as surely as if there had been a brass plate engraved with the name. This was the chair of the man who had been there longest, or the widow who took her evening tea by the window, or the retired officer who read his newspaper there every evening at 6 without variation or apology for 40 weeks running. To sit in that chair as a new lodger, bright-eyed and unaware, was to commit an act of social trespass that would be registered without comment by every person in the room. Nobody would say anything. That was the point. The silence was the message. And you would understand, if you had any sensitivity at all, that something had happened which would need to be addressed, that you would need, at the next available opportunity, to establish very clearly by your seating choices that you understood the geography of the room and would henceforth operate within it. This particular rule applied to everything in the house that was shared but not equal. The best spot at the window, the warmest end of the table, the hook in the hallway where the most senior lodger hung his coat. None of it was written down. All of it was real, and navigation of it required a kind of social intelligence that the etiquette books could advise on in general terms but could not actually teach you. You had to read the room, and the room in a Victorian boarding house was exceptionally good at being read. There were also rules about what you talked about. We have already visited the dining table, where certain subjects, religion, politics, and anything that could be described as a matter of strong personal feeling were maintained at a careful arm's length. But outside the table, in the parlor, in the evenings, in the hallway, in passing, in the brief exchanges that constituted the texture of shared daily life, there were additional rules that operated with similar force. You did not ask about money. This was not in the Victorian context simple rudeness. It was deeper than that. In a house where everyone was there fundamentally because they needed affordable accommodation. In a house where the financial margin between respectable and desperate was often thinner than anyone at the table would acknowledge. Asking a fellow lodger directly about their financial situation was like pointing at a wound. It acknowledged what everyone was trying not to acknowledge, that the boarding house was, for most of its inhabitants, a symptom of economic limitation rather than a lifestyle choice. So it was not asked, and in not asking it, everyone maintained a fiction that was kind and slightly absurd in equal measure. The fiction that they were all simply here because they found it agreeable, that the terms were convenient, that there was nothing in the least uncomfortable about 8 people sharing the bathroom arrangements and the tablecloth and the armchairs by the fire. The performance required of everyone at the boarding house table was a performance of contentment. Not happiness. Nobody was demanding happiness, just contentment. The quiet, composed appearance of someone for whom this arrangement was perfectly satisfactory. Thank you very much, and who had no particular feelings about it either way. Of course, sometimes people broke the rules. Not dramatically. Not in the spectacular, novelistic fashion that Dickens enjoyed and that the Victorian periodical press reported with relish whenever a boarding house dispute made its way to the magistrate's court. Usually it was smaller than that. The slow accumulation of small infractions. The coat left on someone else's hook one too many times. The habit of arriving at breakfast and barely speaking, which was within the rules but combined with a slightly offensive quality of non-presence that communicated something more pointed than mere quietness. The lodger who played cards in his room with visitors on Sunday evenings and whose door never quite closed properly, so that the sounds of an enjoyable time drifted into the corridor where other lodgers who were not having an enjoyable time could hear it perfectly. And then the calculation that the landlady made, because the landlady was in all of this the adjudicator, not a judge, not publicly. She would never have called herself that, but she held the balance in the house. She decided which infractions were noted and which were addressed. She decided which lodgers' transgressions were the result of ignorance and could be corrected with a quiet word, and which were the result of character, which was harder to correct and tended to mean, eventually, a conversation about the usual notice. 1 week. The week's notice was the boarding house equivalent of a verdict. Once it was delivered, there was no appeal. There was only the packing of the bag and the search for another address, and the careful management of the reference you would need from the landlady you were leaving if you wanted to find another house of similar respectability, which meant in practice that most people behaved themselves most of the time because the alternative was not just uncomfortable, it was professionally, socially, practically dangerous. And yet, and this is the thing I keep coming back to, the rules, for all their weight, were not cruel. I have been thinking about this for a while, and I keep arriving at the same conclusion. The unwritten rules of the Victorian boarding house were fundamentally the rules of shared life. Not the rules of a prison, not the rules of a workplace, the rules of a community of people who needed each other, who needed the food, the warmth, the structure, and most importantly, the mutual agreement to maintain a livable atmosphere, and who had worked out over decades of collective Victorian boarding house life how to do that. Be on time, be dressed, be civil at the table, know which chair is not yours, don't ask about money, don't bring strangers into the house without warning. Keep your part of the world in a condition that doesn't make anyone else's harder. These are, I would argue, the same rules that govern every functional shared space that has ever existed. The Victorian boarding house just made them visible by placing them in a context where they could not be taken for granted. where the wrong person in the right chair could unseat weeks of carefully maintained equilibrium in a matter of minutes. There is a final rule I want to tell you about. It is perhaps the most interesting of all, the rule of not noticing. In a house of thin walls and shared tables and unavoidable proximity, there was an enormous amount that every lodger knew about every other lodger that they were expected to behave as though they did not know. The woman who had been crying again last Thursday, the man who had not paid his rent and was attempting to manage this quietly, the young lodger who had received a letter that changed the shape of their day and had come down to breakfast looking like someone who had not slept and would not be sleeping anytime soon. You knew all of it, and the rule, the kindest rule in the house, was that you noticed none of it. Unless, of course, the person in question wanted to be noticed, in which case you noticed, and you sat with it, and you passed the bread across without comment. And that quietly, wordlessly, perfectly, was how strangers took care of each other in the Victorian boarding house. It is a kind of care that I think deserves more credit than it usually gets. Not dramatic, not memorable, not the stuff of novels. Just the daily, steady, reliable act of choosing to be decent to the person next to you, even when you have not chosen them, even when they occasionally sit in your chair, even when their timing at breakfast is frankly a mystery. And into this particular atmosphere of careful, managed humanity, the food and the rules and the thin walls and the small acts of grace, came the parts of boarding house life that the etiquette guides never quite figured out how to address. Love, gossip, ambition, secrets, the things that bloom specifically in the conditions of enforced closeness and maintained distance, which is exactly where we are headed next. Nobody in the history of Victorian social commentary ever sat down and wrote honestly about what a boarding house smelled like. Not the satirists who mocked the food, not the novelists who dramatized the social tensions, not the reformers who cataloged the sleeping arrangements with clinical attention to square footage. They all wrote around it. And the reason they wrote around it is the same reason that you, if you have ever entered an unfamiliar home and been struck immediately by a specific combination of smells, understand perfectly. Smell is intimate in a way that description is not. Smell puts you directly inside a moment with a specificity that words almost cannot reach. But let me try. Close your eyes for a moment, metaphorically at least, since you are presumably listening. And let me put you inside a Victorian boarding house on a Tuesday evening in late November, around the year 1878. The coal fire has been lit in the hallway since 3 in the afternoon. Coal fires in the Victorian era did not produce the gentle, romantic warmth that the imagination tends to supply. They produced heat. Yes, they also produced sulfurous compounds, soot, and a particular thick, yellowish haze that clung to the soft furnishings and gradually colonized every curtain, every cushion, and every item of clothing that spent more than an hour in the room. The impure gas of the Victorian era, historians of domestic life have noted, also gave off its own distinct smell from the wall brackets and gasoliers, a faintly sulfuric, slightly chemical undertone that Victorians were so accustomed to that they no longer noticed it unless it was absent. Then the kitchen, specifically the cabbage. Boiled cabbage was a constant presence in Victorian boarding house cooking. Cheap, filling, available through most of the year. The smell of it permeated everything. Fabric absorbed it. Wallpaper absorbed it. Harriet Martineau, the Victorian writer and social reformer, once described the particular difficulty of maintaining respectable social intercourse in a room that smelled primarily of last night's dinner. And she meant this quite literally. Then the wool. Victorian clothing was primarily wool. And wet wool in a cold hallway produces a smell that is not exactly unpleasant, but is extremely present. Then the tobacco. Male lodgers in particular smoked in their rooms, in the parlor if allowed, in the spaces between other people's stated preferences, with the cheerful obliviousness of men who had not yet been asked to stop. And underneath all of it, the house itself. The older the house, the richer the accumulated smell. Cold dust embedded in the wood of the floors, Decades of cooking and soap and candle wax and human life layered into the walls as surely as the paint. This was what you walked into every day. This was what home smelled like. Now I want to be careful here, because there is a temptation when describing the sensory texture of the past to land too heavily on the unpleasant. To turn history into a kind of guided tour of discomfort where the point is always how much better we have it now. That is not the point I am making, because within all of that, the coal, the cabbage, the wool, there were also the smells that people loved. The specific comfort smells of the Victorian boarding house that I think we have lost, and that I think we occasionally miss without quite knowing what we're missing. The smell of bread being toasted over the fire at breakfast. Coal fires, when they were burning cleanly, have a particular warm smell that is genuinely comforting in a way that modern central heating simply is not. Tea, properly made in a pot that has been used 1,000 times and absorbed the tannins into the clay itself. And in December, always in December, something that the cook had done to the sweet pudding that was entirely mysterious and resulted in a smell that came from the kitchen on Sunday afternoon like a reward. Smell is memory. And for the Victorian lodger far from home, certain smells in that house became over time the smell of the only home they had. Let us talk about what they actually ate, not the theoretical boarding house menu I described earlier. The Sunday joint and the Tuesday stew and the Thursday fish that followed their predictable rotation like the seasons. I want to talk about what the food tasted like, because this is where the Victorian boarding house diverges most sharply from what we imagine when we imagine Victorian cooking. Mrs. Beeton, the great authority on Victorian domestic management, whose book of household management was the Bible of the respectable Victorian kitchen, advocated a cooking philosophy that modern food historians describe with a kind of respectful bewilderment. She recommended boiling almost everything. Vegetables boiled until soft. Meat boiled until the texture and the color had departed entirely. And what remained was something that could be described generously as thoroughly cooked. The boarding house cook, working with limited budget and limited time, took this philosophy and applied it with considerable efficiency. The result, and I say this with genuine sympathy for everyone involved, was food that was safe, filling, and almost entirely without character. A medical commentator writing in the 1870s described the condition of certain boarding house meals in terms that were more forensic than culinary. He noted the particular grayness of the mutton, the opacity of the soup, the bread that was entirely adequate on Monday, and progressing by Wednesday toward a kind of philosophical position on firmness that challenged simple description. And yet, and I find this genuinely interesting, the Victorian working diet, when examined by nutritional historians, was in certain respects more nutrient-rich than we might assume. Between 1877 and 1889, the cost of the average national food basket fell by approximately 30%, as refrigerated transport and cheaper imports transformed what was available. The diet was monotonous. Yes, it was often bland beyond the point of culinary sympathy, but it was based on real ingredients. Bread, when it was good, was genuinely good. Root vegetables, cheap and plentiful, provided more nutrition than they were typically given credit for. The onion, which at half a penny for 12 was one of the cheapest foods anyone could buy anywhere in Victorian England or America, was roasted, fried, stewed, and incorporated into soups and gravies with such thoroughness that it formed essentially the base note of the entire boarding house culinary experience. Now, I want to tell you about something that has stayed with me from all the reading I have done on Victorian boarding house food. There was a specific phenomenon that the literature returns to again and again with a mix of mild horror and reluctant affection: the Sunday pudding. Every respectable boarding house served a pudding on Sunday. It was the one guaranteed extravagance of the week, the thing that elevated Sunday dinner from mere sustenance to something that approached, however humbly, the category of occasion. Sweet pudding typically, or a roly-poly filled with jam, or a spotted dick, which is, for anyone unfamiliar, simply a sweet pudding with dried currants in it, and a name that Victorians found entirely unremarkable, and that has provided amusement to English schoolchildren ever since. These puddings were not elegant. They were not subtle. They were dense, sweet, filling, served hot with a puddle of something adjacent to custard. And they produced in the lodgers who consumed them an almost universal sense of contentment that the rest of the week's food entirely failed to generate. Which tells you something about the power of expectation and about the specific pleasure of something that arrives reliably on schedule, once a week, without fail. There is another thing about the food that I want to address, because I think it reveals something important about the psychology of boarding house life. People cheated, not in a criminal sense, in the perfectly understandable, very human sense of maintaining private food supplies in their rooms that supplemented the official meals in ways the landlady knew about and chose not to address. A Victorian guide to London lodgings from the 1860s describes, with a weary tone of someone who has seen everything, the phenomenon of the private store. The personal collection of tea, sugar, butter, biscuits, and occasional items of a more fortifying nature that the long-term lodger kept in their room against the possibility of official meals proving insufficient. This was technically against the spirit of the boarding arrangement. It was also absolutely universal. The landlady knew perfectly well it was happening, and whoever operated a duplicate key to the closet where such things were stored, as at least one Victorian account notes with what I can only describe as a magnificent understatement, chose as a rule not to address it directly, because the alternative was a confrontation, and a confrontation in a boarding house was the beginning of the end of something that was working. So the private biscuit tin stayed in the drawer. The personal jar of marmalade remained on the shelf. The small bottle of port that appeared on cold evenings. Nobody asked about the port. Everyone noted the port. Nobody asked. This is, I think, one of my favorite things about boarding house life. This mutual, practical, entirely unacknowledged generosity of not asking about the port. So, let me ask you something, because this is something I genuinely spend time thinking about when I work through this material. Have you ever noticed how food and smell are the things that stay longest? Not the conversations, not the events, the specific smell of a particular house, the taste of something someone made for you once that you have never quite been able to replicate. The Victorians, who could not preserve most other aspects of their experience, no photographs from most of them, no recordings, were left in the end with exactly these things. The smell of the coal fire on a November morning, the taste of the Sunday pudding, the sound the kettle made at a specific hour. These were the coordinates of home. And for the lodger who had been in that house for 2 years, who had seen 6 other lodgers come and go, who knew the coal schedule and the menu rotation and which step on the staircase creaked, these specific sensory details were what the place actually was. Not the room, not the furniture. The accumulated experience of living there, absorbed into the body the way cold smoke absorbed into the curtains. Invisibly, slowly, completely. Which brings me to the last thing in this part of our story. The thing they tried to hide. Not the private biscuit tin. That was practical. Not the port. That was just sensible. I mean the smell of desperation. This is the part that the sensory history of the Victorian boarding house does not usually address directly, but I think it needs to be addressed, because in a house of thin walls and shared corridors, certain things become apparent that no amount of social performance at the dining table can conceal. The lodger who was washing the same shirt every single night, hanging it over the chair to dry by morning, because it was his only presentable one. The woman who'd been making the same dress last 3 seasons by turning the collar, adjusting the hem, adding a new ribbon, each alteration representing weeks of careful work and an intimate knowledge of the frontier between respectable and not. The man who ate every meal with the concentrated focus of someone for whom each plate was not assumed. These were not things that were discussed. They were not things that were acknowledged in the polite social world of the boarding house dining room. But they were known. They were known in the way that things are always known when people live in close proximity to each other with very few places to hide, and the kindness of not speaking of them. The collective, quiet, daily act of seeing something difficult and choosing to let it pass without remark was, I think, one of the most sophisticated social skills that the Victorian boarding house produced. Not the elaborate etiquette of the drawing room, not the perfect management of the seating plan, just the ability to look at someone who is struggling and offer them the dignity of not being looked at. There is a thread that runs through everything that the Victorian boarding house was, through the food and the smells and the rules and the characters. And it is this: people were trying. They were trying in conditions that were often uncomfortable and sometimes genuinely difficult, to maintain a version of themselves that they could respect in the morning. And the boarding house, for all its limitations, for all the thin walls and the predictable mutton and the duplicated keys, gave them the structure within which that trying was possible. We are not perhaps so far from that ourselves, but the boarding house was not only a place of quiet endurance. There were things that happened inside it, things that the rules were supposed to prevent, things that the thin walls ensured could not be secret, things that the proximity of 8 carefully maintained strangers made paradoxically more likely, that we've not yet talked about at all. Because we have been, until now, quite well behaved in our tour of this house. And the house, as anyone who has spent a month in close quarters with strangers knows, does not always stay well behaved. The Victorian boarding house parlor was one of the most carefully studied rooms in all of 19th-century social fiction. Trollope returned to it repeatedly. So did Gissing. Dickens had been there first and built it into farce. The reason all these writers kept coming back to the same room, the shared sitting room, the common parlor, was not that the room itself was interesting. It was that the room did something nothing else in Victorian urban life quite did. It put people from different classes, different histories, different ambitions on the same furniture. Not the street, where you pass strangers at speed. Not the office, where hierarchy was fixed and formal. The parlor, where you had to sit for an hour every evening with whoever was already there when you arrived. And into that arrangement, with its absolute impossibility of comfortable indifference, love walked with a frequency that appalled the moralists and delighted everyone who had ever been lonely and found that the person across the room was not, after all, a stranger. Let me begin with a true story. The writer and critic Anthony Trollope, author of 47 novels, a man who produced work at such volume that his contemporaries assumed either he did not sleep or he employed a team of literary elves, published in the 1860s a short story called The Courtship of Susan Bell. It is based, as many of Trollope's sharper observations were, on a version of something he had seen or been told. Mrs. Bell is a respectable widow in Saratoga Springs, New York. She takes in lodgers in the summer months, not from inclination, but from the arithmetic of widowhood and a modest income. Her lodgers are usually elderly ladies. One winter, a young engineer arrives on her doorstep looking for rooms while working on repairs to the local railway. He comes recommended. Mrs. Bell takes him in with trepidation. Very quickly, he develops a decided interest in her younger daughter, Susan. And the story that follows, which is not particularly dramatic by the standards of Victorian fiction that prided itself on drama, is simply this: 2 people who live in the same house, at the same table, in the same parlor every evening, discover each other. Trollope understood that this required no plot, no coincidence, no dramatic contrivance, just proximity and time, and the accumulated weight of someone being present every morning when you came downstairs. The boarding house was, according to historians of the Victorian era, one of the primary venues in which marriages were made among the working and lower middle classes throughout the second half of the 19th century. Not the only venue, not even perhaps the most common, but a significant one, and one that produced a specific kind of relationship that was different from marriages made through family introduction, through church acquaintance, or through the more formal courtship procedures of the respectable middle classes, because the boarding house did not allow for the management of first impressions. You did not meet someone at the boarding house table in your finest clothes, with your best conversation, at your most composed. You met them at breakfast. possibly slightly late, definitely before you had properly collected yourself and assembled the social personality you wore for public occasions. You were seen, and here is the terrifying and somehow wonderful part, as you actually were. The clerk with the mended boot. The young woman whose hair came undone when the wind caught it in the doorway on Tuesday afternoon. The person who was cheerful at dinner, but clearly struggling by Thursday. You could not maintain the performance indefinitely in a house where the same people saw you every day. And something about that exposure, that inability to sustain the fiction of your best self, was paradoxically exactly the condition in which genuine attachment grew. Because you could trust what you felt. It was not about the performance. It was about the person behind it. This is not, of course, the story the Victorians told about themselves. The Victorians told a story in which romantic feeling was managed, supervised, chaperoned, and expressed only through the approved channels. Calling cards and morning visits, and the careful orchestration of encounters that appeared accidental but were anything but. Courtship in the official Victorian version required chaperones and propriety, and the slow, formal progression from acquaintance to understanding to engagement. In the boarding house, none of this was structurally possible. There were no chaperones. There was no managed progression. There was just Tuesday breakfast and Wednesday dinner, and the Sunday evening parlor where everyone sat together, and someone occasionally read aloud, and the fire made everyone warmer than they ought to be, and the social rules that governed public meetings loosened almost imperceptibly under the pressure of familiarity. The drawing room, as scholars of the Victorian boarding house have noted, was one of the only spaces in the era where women could meet men on something approaching equal social footing, where a conversation in the presence of others could advance without requiring the formal architecture of introduction. And what happened in those parlors? The exchanges that began as polite conversation and became something that both parties recognized with a small interior shock as more than that, happened thousands of times in boarding houses across England and America throughout the Victorian period, with all the awkwardness and tenderness and potential for disaster that such things have always carried. Not all of it ended in marriage. Naturally, the gossip economy of a boarding house was by any measure one of the most efficient in Victorian urban life. In a house where everyone knew everyone else's schedule, where the walls transmitted the relevant information whether asked to or not, and where the breakfast table functioned as a daily meeting in which nothing could be said, but everything was noted. Nothing that happened between two lodgers remained invisible to the other lodgers for long. The Etiquette Guide, our deportment from 1882, included a pointed section on the impropriety of allowing romantic inclinations to become publicly visible in shared social spaces. It stated that no gentleman and lady should allow their particular interest in each other to manifest in a way that might embarrass or exclude the company. In practice, this meant, if you were falling in love with a man 2 tables down, you were expected to conduct this experience with such perfect outward composure that no one watching you could detect it, which is, I will admit, a social demand of quite extraordinary difficulty, and it failed often visibly. The historian Sharon Marcus, writing about the social dynamics of Victorian shared accommodation, describes the boarding house as a space that generated intimacies that exceeded the formal social norms, where the closeness of daily life produced exactly the conditions that official propriety was designed to prevent. And the other lodgers noticed, and they talked, not loudly, not cruelly necessarily, but with the particular concentrated attention of people who had very little other entertainment and were watching the same drama unfold meal by meal, with the suspended interest of an audience that has not yet been told how the story ends. Let me tell you something that I find both touching and slightly mortifying about this corner of Victorian social life. People fell in love in boarding houses, and then they had nowhere to go. They could not call on each other privately. That violated the rules. They could not correspond. Letters arriving at a shared address were observed by the whole household. They could not arrange accidental meetings in a house where everyone knew everyone else's schedule. Accidental, was a concept with very limited operational range. What they could do was exist in the same room every evening, saying entirely appropriate things to entirely other people, while being perfectly aware of each other's exact position in the room at all times. This is the kind of emotional experience that Trollope understood and described with a precision that still feels recognizable today. The particular torture of caring about someone who is present enough to notice and present enough to know you have noticed. And in the boarding house parlor, with its shared sofas and its fire and its other lodgers all doing exactly the same thing, existing with perfectly maintained composure while secretly in the grip of feelings they were not going to mention. The density of unspoken experience in that room must have been at times almost atmospheric. Of course, alongside the tenderness, there was ambition. Ambition in a boarding house had its own particular character. Because the boarding house was, as we have established, one of the few spaces in Victorian life where class mixing happened routinely, where a junior clerk might sit at the same table as a retired naval officer, where a seamstress might share a parlor with the daughter of a ruined merchant, where the person who had fallen farthest was sometimes seated directly opposite the person who was trying hardest to rise. This produced something that the sociologists of the era called social aspiration, and that I would call, in more honest terms, the specific human experience of being in a room full of people who are slightly above, below, or level with you, and trying to work out which category you fall into and whether any of it can be changed. The boarding house was a school of observation. Long-term lodgers became extraordinarily good at reading the small signals of status and position that Victorian society communicated in every detail of dress and speech and manner. The cut of a coat, the quality of a reference to some author or event that indicated the level of education behind it. The particular way of carrying oneself that marked the difference between someone who had grown up with money and someone who had grown up aspiring to it. The clerk who sat across the table from the man who had a position at the firm he wanted to join. That clerk watched everything. He filed every piece of information. He calibrated his own behavior against the model in front of him. He learned, over months of daily observation, exactly how to present himself to the people who could open doors for him. In this sense, the Victorian boarding house was a finishing school for the upwardly mobile. Not the formal kind, but the kind that worked by proximity and attention and the careful daily study of what success looked like from the chair directly opposite. And then there were the secrets. Every boarding house had them. Not the kind of secrets that ended in scandal. Those are the ones the newspapers reported and the etiquette manuals warned against and the novelists exploited for everything they were worth. I mean the ordinary secrets, the kind that anyone in any enclosed community carries around for weeks or months before they either disperse naturally or become undeniably apparent. The lodger who had lost his position but not yet told anyone, who came and went at the usual hours with the usual briefcase while quietly searching for something to replace the thing he had lost. The woman who had been sending money home each week to a family member who was ill and who had been eating less to cover the additional cost, and who had developed a specific relationship with the bread basket that the other lodgers had noticed and carefully, kindly not mentioned. The man who'd been writing something, reams of it night after night, by the sound of the scratching pen, and who never mentioned it and clearly did not want to be asked about it, and who was perhaps writing the thing that would change his life, or perhaps not. He never said. Nobody knew. George Gissing, who knew this world from inside it, having lived in boarding houses in London through the 1880s while writing the novels that would eventually secure his reputation, described the experience later as a time of absolute creative isolation. The proximity of other people, he wrote, had paradoxically deepened his solitude. In a house full of others, he'd been entirely alone in the way that mattered, which is, I think, one of the most honest things anyone has ever said about what it is to be a writer, or for that matter, about what it is to be human in a crowd. Here is the question that keeps returning to me as I sit with all of this, and I want to put it to you directly. When you think about the loneliness that these people carried, the clerk, the widow, the writer, the person falling in love with someone they could not reach, across the table to touch, Do you find it distant historical, or does some part of it feel familiar? Because I keep thinking that we have more sophisticated versions of most things, better food, better hygiene, better privacy, but that the essential emotional geography of a boarding house is not very different from a great deal of modern life. The feeling of being in a room full of people and not being known by any of them. The feeling of wanting something badly, but not being able to say so. The specific experience of being lonely in a way that is private and undisclosed while maintaining at the surface the performance of contentment. The Victorian boarding house lodger navigated all of this with the resources available to them. The careful observance of rules, the small acts of kindness that never needed to be named, the patience of a person who understood that the city did not owe them anything, but that the house, despite everything, was keeping them alive. And the house continued, while its lodgers loved and gossiped and aspired and grieved in relative silence. While all this invisible life accumulated in the walls, the city outside was moving, building up its problems, generating with the industrious Victorian energy. It was famous for a set of public health crises, social reform campaigns, and legislative battles that were aimed directly at the boarding house. Because not everyone agreed that this was a reasonable way for people to live. Not everyone thought that the answer to urban poverty was a shared table and thin walls and a landlady with a duplicate key. Some of them had different ideas, loud ones with committees. Not every boarding house was a place of Sunday pudding and parlor conversations and love quietly forming across the dinner table. That is the version of the story that the respectable middle classes prefer to tell themselves. The Bloomsbury boarding house of the etiquette guides, the carefully managed establishment with lace curtains, and a landlady who took references and kept the tablecloths clean and knew the name of every lodger's employer. That house existed. It was real, but it shared a city with another kind of house entirely. The kind that the respectable classes crossed streets to avoid discussing, the kind that ended up in newspaper reports, coroner's inquests, and parliamentary debates about the state of the urban poor. The kind that was not a refuge. It was a trap. Let us start at the bottom of the scale. The common lodging house, which the Victorian middle classes distinguished from the respectable boarding house with an anxiety bordering on obsession, was a world that operated by entirely different rules. 4 pence a night for a bed, or 8 pence if you were sharing it. The historian Joseph O'Neill, in his study of the Victorian lodging house, describes what that 4 pence actually bought. You were shown to a room. The room contained, in varying configurations, anywhere from 6 to 30 other people on beds that were spaced close enough together that you could hear the breathing of the stranger on either side. There was no privacy. There was frequently no way to secure your belongings, your boots, your coat, any small object of value, against the people sleeping at arm's length from you. The experienced lodger slept with his hat under his head, not for comfort, but because the hat contained his money, and the money had to stay within physical contact at all times or it would not be there in the morning. The walls and ceilings of these houses were required under the Common Lodging Houses Acts of 1851 and 1853, legislation pushed through Parliament by Lord Shaftesbury after 2 decades of documented campaigning, to be lime-washed twice a year. This requirement tells you something important, not just about the conditions of the houses before the legislation was passed, but about how bad those conditions must have been to make lime washing twice a year seem like a meaningful improvement. Disease moved through Victorian lodging houses the way fire moves through dry wood. Typhoid fever, which the medical historian Jacob Steer Williams describes as the Victorian era's preeminent disease of insanitation, thrived in conditions of shared water, poor drainage, and dense habitation. Prince Albert himself died of typhoid in 1861, which rather made the point to anyone still uncertain that the disease respected no class, but it killed far more of the poor than the aristocracy. In 1838, and this is a figure that once encountered does not easily leave you, The estimated life expectancy for a laborer in London was 17 years. Not 17 years shorter than the wealthy, 17 years total, against which number a rural laborer in England could expect to live to approximately 38. The difference, 21 years of life, was essentially the cost of living in the city, of breathing the air, drinking the water, and sleeping in the kind of accommodation that the Victorian urban economy had produced for its poorest workers. The common lodging houses were, in the language of the era, described as seabeds of infectious disease. They were also described, sometimes in the same sentence, as training schools for criminals. This is a phrase worth pausing on, because the Victorian reformers and journalists who descended into the common lodging houses to document their conditions for an appalled middle-class readership. Henry Mayhew, whose multi-volume London Labour and the London Poor remains one of the great works of Victorian social journalism, found something considerably more complicated than the simple moral catastrophe their editors expected. Yes, there were criminals in the common lodging houses. There were thieves and swindlers and people who made a living in ways that the law did not sanction. But there were also, in the same rooms, on the same beds, breathing the same air, people who were simply cold, who had nowhere else to go, who had come down through illness or bad luck, or the specific cruelty of an economic system that had no safety net worth the name to 4 pence a night in the hope that tomorrow would be different. 3 of Jack the Ripper's victims in 1888 had been living in lodging houses on Flower and Dean Street in Whitechapel, a street where, at the height of the Victorian era, virtually every building on both sides was either a lodging house or directly connected to one. 4 pence for a bed, or the alternative. The particular horror of that detail is not the crime. It is the context, the absolute narrowness of the margin between surviving and not, between a roof over your head and the street. And then there was the fraud. The Victorian city produced, alongside its overcrowded lodging houses, a particular species of predatory establishment that occupied the gray space between legitimate accommodation and something considerably darker. These were the houses that advertised themselves in respectable language. Rooms available, terms moderate, inquire within. And that targeted specifically the newly arrived, the unfamiliar with the city, the young woman alone from the country who did not yet know the signs that differentiated a well-managed house from a dangerous one. The researcher and journalist William Thomas Stead, who in 1885 published his exposé in the Pall Mall Gazette under the title The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, documented in graphic and disturbing detail how certain lodging establishments in London used the promise of accommodation and respectable employment to exploit vulnerable young women who arrived in the city without the knowledge or connections to protect themselves. The response was eventually legislative. The Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 raised the age of consent and introduced new offenses targeting exactly the kind of exploitation Stead had documented. But the legislation came, as most Victorian legislation came on social matters, after the damage had already been extensive, and after the documentation of that damage had become too public and too detailed to ignore. What I want to think about here, and I think this is worth sitting with, is what it actually meant to be a vulnerable person navigating this world without a guide. Because the Victorian city, for all its energy and possibility, had no official mechanism for directing someone who had just arrived toward the good houses rather than the bad ones. There was no consumer protection, no licensing system that would have been meaningful in practice. Despite the legislative gestures toward regulation, no one waiting at the railway station with a list of reputable addresses and the street wisdom to distinguish them from the ones that were not. You had word of mouth. You had, if you were fortunate, a letter of introduction. You had the judgment you had brought from wherever you came from, which might be acute if you'd been schooled by people who knew the dangers, or entirely inadequate if you had not. And you had your ability to read the signs, the condition of the front steps, the quality of the light behind the windows, whether the landlady opened the door herself or sent a child, and which kind of child, and whether the child looked well fed. These were the signs the experienced Victorian city dweller learned to read. The newcomer had to learn them fast, or pay the consequences. The common lodging houses also had a problem that no amount of lime-washing regulations quite addressed. They were required under the early legislation to be vacated each day between 10 in the morning and late afternoon. This meant that the lodger, even the sick lodger, even the old woman who could barely walk the length of the corridor, was put out on the street every morning in whatever weather London or Manchester or Birmingham could produce, and told to come back when the house reopened. In winter, in rain, without the coat they had left inside because they could not take their belongings with them, and they could not lock the room. This regulation, which was designed to enforce cleanliness and ventilation, effectively punished the most vulnerable lodgers for the conditions their poverty had placed them in. It is the kind of policy that seems on paper to be about hygiene. In practice, it was about discomfort, about making the lives of the poorest people slightly more uncomfortable so that they would perhaps choose not to be poor somewhere else, which was, as housing historians have noted with dry precision, not quite how poverty worked. Now, and I want to be careful here, because this part of the story requires both honesty and a certain accuracy. The boarding house world did not divide neatly into the virtuous middle-class house and the criminal common lodging house at the bottom. There was an enormous middle ground. There were boarding houses that were respectable in their intentions and inadequate in their execution, where the landlady was doing her best with too little money and too much demand, where the rooms were barely adequate and the food was thin, but where nobody was being deliberately exploited. There were lodgers who abused the system from inside it, who ran up debts they had no intention of paying, who damaged rooms, who brought trouble into houses that had been orderly before they arrived. And there were houses that were perfectly respectable on the surface and deeply uncomfortable underneath, where the landlady's authority curdled into something punitive, where the rules became a mechanism for control rather than for shared civility, where the week's notice was used not as a last resort, but as a first response to any sign of inconvenience. The Victorian boarding house was not inherently benign. It was a space, and like all spaces, its character depended entirely on the people who ran it and the people who inhabited it. What was different about the worst of them, the common doss house, the fraudulent establishment, the house that exploited the newly arrived, was not that they were unusual. They were appallingly common, and they produced steadily over the decades of the Victorian era a public pressure for something better. Not just better regulations, which were passed and largely ignored, but a different way of thinking about what the city owed to the people living in it. There is a detail from the Common Lodging Houses Act of 1853 that I want to leave you with because I think it says everything about the distance between the problem and the response. The act required that the walls of registered lodging houses be lime-washed twice a year. It required that there be adequate ventilation. It required that the sexes be segregated. It required that the keeper notify the authorities of infectious disease. What it did not require was that there be enough food, or that the beds be warm enough in winter, or that a sick person have somewhere to rest during the day, or that a woman arriving alone in a city for the first time have any protection beyond the precarious judgment of a landlady she had never met before. The act addressed the infrastructure. It did not address the human being inside it, which was, in a sense, the defining failure of Victorian social reform, a pattern that repeated itself in housing legislation, in factory acts, in workhouse regulations, in all the elaborate machinery the era built to manage the consequences of its own economic arrangements. It kept measuring the walls. It rarely measured the suffering inside them. And yet, even in the worst of the common lodging houses, even in the doss house where you slept with your hat under your head and your money inside it, Joseph O'Neill found something he had not entirely expected. He found camaraderie, the lodgers who were regulars at the same house, who'd been coming back to the same kitchen, the same fire, the same benches for months or years. They had built, within the limits of their circumstances, something recognizable. Not a community in any organized sense, Not a network, not a system of mutual aid, not an institution, just the specific warmth that builds up between people who have no one else and know it and have decided, without quite articulating it, that this particular group of people who also have no one else is provisionally enough. There is a kind of fellowship in shared extremity that the comfortable never quite understand. It is not chosen. It is not maintained by any particular virtue. It exists because the alternative is complete isolation, and people, most people, almost all people, will reach toward each other in the dark before they will accept the alternative. The reformers who wanted to fix the boarding house arrived with blueprints and bills and committees and good intentions. What they were trying to fix was complicated, and how they went about it, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes disastrously, sometimes both at once, is exactly where we're going next. George Peabody arrived in London in 1837 as a wealthy American banker from Massachusetts who had built a fortune in the transatlantic bond trade and had no particular obligation to spend any of it on the English poor. He was 64 years old. He was not a revolutionary. He was not even, in any ideological sense, a reformer. He was a man of the 19th century who believed, as that century believed, that the moral condition of a society was legible in its physical conditions, that you could read the character of a people in their streets, their buildings, and the quality of the accommodation available to the poorest of them. What he saw when he looked at London's East End seems to have convinced him fairly quickly that this was not a favorable reading. In 1862, at the apex of his wealth and influence, Peabody donated £150,000 to the creation of what would become the Peabody Trust, a fund dedicated to improving the dwellings of the London poor. 150,000 Victorian pounds. To put that in any kind of perspective, the average skilled worker in London in 1862 earned somewhere between £1 and £2 per week. A week's earnings times 150,000. It was an extraordinary sum, and it did build things. The Peabody buildings, plain-faced, sturdy, utilitarian, rose up in Islington and Spitalfields and Bermondsey, and housed thousands of working-class Londoners in conditions that were, by the standards of the era, considerably better than what they had before. But here's the thing about the Peabody buildings that the housing historians mention, and then tend to move past quickly. To get a Peabody flat, you needed a character reference from your employer, which excluded at a stroke everyone in casual or irregular work, everyone between jobs, everyone whose employment was seasonal or precarious or conducted in the gray economy of street trading and domestic service, and the 100 varieties of Victorian survival that fell outside the scope of a regular employer. The very people who most desperately needed better housing, the people who were sleeping in fourpenny common lodging houses and taking the worst rooms in the worst houses, were precisely the people who could not produce the character reference the Peabody Trust required. The American philanthropist Charles Booth, who between 1886 and 1897 produced the monumental survey of London life and labor, arguably the most comprehensive document of Victorian poverty ever assembled, put the problem with the precision of a man who had spent a decade counting it. The housing question was not only a question of quantity. It was a question of access, and access was governed by exactly the same social mechanisms that governed everything else in Victorian life. Character, reference, and the appearance of respectability, which meant that reform, for all its philanthropic energy and legislative ambition, was largely improving the conditions of the people who were already slightly above the absolute bottom. The absolute bottom remained exactly where it was. There was, however, a woman who tried a different approach. Her name was Octavia Hill, and she is, in my view, one of the most interesting figures in the entire history of Victorian social reform. Not because she succeeded in fixing the housing problem, which she did not, but because she identified something about it that almost everyone else had missed. Hill began, in 1864, when she was 26 years old, persuading the writer and critic John Ruskin, whose father had recently died and left him a considerable sum, to invest in her idea for managing slum properties in Marylebone. The idea was this: she would buy a small number of deteriorating properties. She would renovate them to decent habitation. She would charge rents that were fair but consistent, and she would personally, or through her system of female housing managers, visit every tenant every week. Not to inspect, not primarily to collect the rent, to know them, to know when the family's main earner had lost work this week and could not make rent and why, to know when a child was ill or a repair was needed, to know whether the problem was structural or situational, whether what this family needed was a reduction in rent this month, or help finding steadier employment, or simply someone to talk to who was not their landlord. By 1874, Octavia Hill had 15 housing schemes, managing approximately 3,000 tenants. The scheme generated a return for Ruskin. The properties were maintained. The tenants stayed. It was not, she always insisted, charity. It was management. Human management applied to the specific situation of people living in difficult circumstances who are not inherently incapable of managing their own lives. They were simply managing them in conditions that made management almost impossible. The Victorians had a phrase for what she was doing. They called it self-help. It was the philosophical framework articulated most famously by Samuel Smiles in his 1859 book of the same name that dominated the era's thinking about poverty and its remedies. Self-help was a genuine bestseller. It sold 250,000 copies by the end of the century. Its central argument was simple. Poverty was not an inevitable condition. It was a circumstance, and circumstances could be changed by application, by discipline, by the cultivation of habits that the successful had demonstrated were universally available to anyone with the will to adopt them, which was, as many people have pointed out, both partly true and wildly unfair at the same time. It was partly true in that individual effort and self-discipline did make a measurable difference to individual outcomes in Victorian life. The evidence was everywhere. The city was full of people who had started with nothing and built, through work and careful management, something more. It was wildly unfair in that it took the successes as evidence of the possibility of individual advancement and ignored the structural conditions that determined how many people working equally hard with equal discipline still ended up in four-penny lodging houses, because the structural conditions of the Victorian economy left nowhere else for them to go. But here is where the story of boarding house reform gets genuinely interesting. Because the reformers were not only philanthropists and legislators, they were also investigative journalists. And in the Victorian era, investigative journalism, when it was good, was very, very good indeed. Henry Mayhew, whose London Labour and the London Poor was published in volumes through the 1850s and 60s, had spent years going into the common lodging houses himself. Not to document them from the outside, but from the inside, talking to the people who lived there, asking them in the direct, specific terms of someone who was genuinely curious about the answer what their life actually looked like. What he published was not what his comfortable readership expected. He found, in the common lodging houses of London's East End, people whose range and particularity was entirely inconsistent with the simple narrative of criminal degradation that the era preferred. He found street performers and unemployed artisans. He found former soldiers and discharged servants. He found people who had, within the last year or two, been living lives that were substantially more comfortable and had arrived at the common lodging house via a path of misfortune that could, in many cases, have happened to almost anyone. The difference between a person in a common lodging house and a person in a Bloomsbury boarding house was not, Mayhew concluded, primarily a difference of character. It was primarily a difference of luck, and the difference of luck was sustained and made permanent by a system that had no mechanism for reversing it. Now I want to tell you about a specific moment of reform that I think illustrates the whole problem with extraordinary precision. In 1851, the same year as the Great Exhibition, London's celebration of its own industrial triumph, Parliament passed the Common Lodging Houses Act. It was on paper significant legislation. It empowered local authorities to frame regulations for common lodging houses, to set limits on how many people could sleep in each room, to inspect the premises, to require that keepers report outbreaks of infectious disease. In practice, the act suffered from a problem that housing historians have described as definitional incompleteness. It could not precisely define what a common lodging house was. Registration was not of premises, but of the names of keepers, which meant that a keeper who acquired a bad record could simply move to a different address and start again with no obligation to declare the previous history. The inspectors who were supposed to enforce the act were overwhelmed, underpaid, and operating in a legal environment that gave them authority without enforcement mechanism. And the requirement that lodging houses be vacated during the day, which we've already visited in our journey through the darker side of these places, resulted in the spectacle of the city's poorest residents being turned out onto the streets every morning, regardless of weather or health. The act was not useless. Where it was applied diligently, it made genuine improvements, but it was nowhere near adequate to the scale of the problem, and the problem was not standing still. The population was still growing. The city was still expanding. The demand for cheap accommodation was still outpacing every philanthropic and legislative attempt to supply decent alternatives. There is a moment in Charles Booth's survey, gathered in the 1880s across hundreds of interviews with working-class Londoners in every district and occupation, that stays with me as the most honest summary of the entire reform effort. He was describing the conditions in one of London's poorer districts. He noted that improvement had been made, genuine, measurable improvement. The worst houses had been demolished. Regulation had raised the floor of what was permissible. New model buildings offered better conditions to those who could access them. And yet, Booth wrote, the people displaced from the demolished worst houses had not disappeared. They had moved into the next worst houses, and the houses next to those, squeezing the overcrowding tighter and further down the street with each demolition and each regulation that succeeded in removing the most visible problem while leaving entirely intact the underlying conditions that created it. He called this, in a phrase I've never forgotten, the displacement of misery rather than its cure. The displacement of misery rather than its cure. But I do not want to end this part of the story on pure bleakness, because that would be inaccurate. The reformers, for all the incompleteness of their legislation, for all the structural limits of their philanthropic models, did change things. Octavia Hill's housing management system was adopted across Britain and eventually America. The Peabody Trust still exists today and still manages housing in London. The Public Health Act of 1875, more comprehensive than the earlier legislation, gave local authorities genuine teeth in sanitary enforcement for the first time. By the end of the Victorian era, the worst excesses of the common lodging house had been reduced, if not eliminated. The limewashing happened eventually. The overcrowding was measurably reduced from its peaks. The beds at the bottom of the scale were generally actual beds, rather than patches of floor. Small victories, genuine ones. And in the middle of the scale, in the respectable boarding houses of Bloomsbury and Saratoga Springs, and the decent terraces of Manchester and Philadelphia, something else was happening. The boarding house was changing. The city was changing around it, and the world that had made the boarding house necessary. The world of precarious wages and no cooking facilities and 6 weeks' journey between a young man and his family was not going to last forever. The question of what replaced the boarding house and what happened to the people who had lived in it is the last piece of this story, and it is, I think, the piece that turns out to be about something bigger than housing. It is about what we lost when we stopped being forced to share the table with people we had not chosen. It did not end dramatically. There was no single morning when the last boarding house in England closed its door with a decisive click and the landlady folded her apron for the final time, and the era simply stopped. It ended the way most things end, gradually, incrementally, almost imperceptibly, through the slow accumulation of changes that seemed individually to have nothing to do with each other, but that were together dismantling the conditions that had made the boarding house necessary in the first place. The railway did it partly. The gas stove helped. The tram finished off the middle section, and the apartment building. That peculiarly 20th century idea that a person deserved a kitchen and a bathroom of their own delivered the final conclusion. Let me take you through what actually happened. In 1850, the boarding house was close to its peak. 1 in 4 households in major American cities housed a boarder. In England, as we established very early in this story, 1 in 8 homes nationwide included a lodger of some kind. The boarding house worked because the conditions that created it were absolute. Workers could not cook. Workers could not afford kitchens. Workers needed to be close to their jobs. And the city, London, Manchester, Boston, Philadelphia, was a place you entered and found yourself trapped by, unable to go back, unable yet to go further in. Then, beginning in the 1860s and gathering speed through the 80s and 90s, the railway remade the geometry of city life. The workmen's trains, cheap early morning fares specifically priced for the working classes, began to open up the suburbs. Not immediately, not equally. The skilled worker, the clerk, the foreman, the people at the top of the working class economic range got there first. Ilford, 7 miles from London's Liverpool Street Station, had 11,000 people in 1891. By 1901, it had 41,000. In 10 years, 7 miles from the city, 2 builders had bought up land and were putting up houses as fast as the demand arrived. A 4-room house in 1906, £260. A 5-bedroom house, £450. And a mortgage. The first mortgages accessible to ordinary working families to make the purchase manageable across years of repayment. The clerk who had lived in a Bloomsbury boarding house for 7 years because it was the only arrangement the economics permitted, that clerk could now, for the first time, imagine something different. His own house, his own door, his own kitchen, the particular domestic solitude that the Victorian boarding house had never been able to offer. The gas stove completed the arithmetic. Throughout most of the Victorian period, domestic cooking required a coal-fired range, a substantial piece of equipment that took up most of a kitchen, required maintenance and expertise to operate, and consumed coal continuously regardless of whether anything was being cooked. The gas stove, which became commercially available and practically affordable in the 1880s and 90s, changed this completely. It required no skill to light. It produced heat on demand. It could be turned off. It could be installed in a small apartment kitchen with the same efficiency as a large one. Suddenly, cooking for yourself was not the multi-hour ordeal of a skilled professional working with specialist equipment. It was something a single person coming home from a long day at the office could actually contemplate. The boarding house had sold, at its core, a service. The service was cooking and the social infrastructure around the table. When cooking became simple enough to do yourself, when the kitchen became a room you could use rather than a room that required a professional to inhabit it, the service became optional. And optional services, when they come with the cost of sharing your private life with 8 strangers, tend not to remain optional for very long. The census data from Hamilton, Ontario, which has been studied in detail by housing historians precisely because its records are unusually complete, tells the story in numbers that are almost too neat to believe. In 1890, approximately 35% of urban households in major North American cities included a boarder or lodger. By 1921, 20%. By 1930, the figure had fallen dramatically, recovering only slightly during the Great Depression, when economic necessity briefly drove people back into shared accommodation. The Great Depression brought the boarding house a last, sad flourish. The return of the economic conditions that had made it necessary, revealing, by contrast, how much had changed between 1870 and 1930. Because the Depression-era boarding house was not the Victorian one. It was not the community of clerks and widows and drifters managing their shared table with practiced social intelligence and the grammar of the unwritten rules. It was simply people without options, living in proximity without the social architecture that the Victorian era had developed over 50 years of collective necessity. The institution had outlived the culture that sustained it. Now here is the question I have been building toward since the first paragraph of this story. When the boarding house died, when the clerk moved to Ilford, and the landlady closed her accounts book, and the dining table was broken up for firewood or sold at auction, what did we lose? Not the bed bugs, clearly. Not the cold water in the washstand every morning. Not the watery soup on a Thursday, or the limited looking glass, or the coal extra that the landlady charged with such consistent creativity. Not any of that, but something else. Something that I have been circling around since the first time I thought seriously about what the boarding house actually was, and that I want to try to name directly. The historian John Modell, who studied boarding and lodging patterns in 19th-century American cities with extraordinary care, described the boarding house as a malleable household. A domestic unit whose membership was unstable by design, that absorbed new people and released others in response to the shifting conditions of the city around it. Malleable, as opposed to rigid, as opposed to the nuclear family, which was exactly as fixed as it sounded, a defined unit with defined members and a door that was socially and legally closed to the outside. The boarding house door was open, by definition, by purpose. The whole point was that strangers came through it, and what that openness produced, for all its impracticality, its noise, its tablecloth politics, its thin walls, and its complicated social grammar, was daily, unavoidable contact between people who had not chosen each other. A social scientist might call this weak ties, the kind of casual, low-intensity connections that research in social psychology has shown to be disproportionately important for individual well-being and for the health of communities. Strong ties are family and close friends, the people you chose, the people who chose you. Weak ties are the acquaintances, the neighbors, the person you see every morning at the coffee shop and nod to, and whose name you might not know, but whose presence in your day has a texture and a warmth that you only notice when it disappears. The boarding house was an industrial-scale producer of weak ties. 8 strangers forced into daily proximity generated almost inevitably, almost accidentally, a web of small connections, small recognitions, small acts of notice that constituted something real, even when it was not named and not particularly valued. The apartment building was a machine for eliminating weak ties. You entered through a private door. You went to a private floor. You entered a private kitchen. And the people on either side of the wall might as well have been living in a different city. I want to be careful here, because I'm not arguing that the boarding house was better than the apartment. It was not. It was noisier, less private, less clean, less safe, and considerably less equipped with the sanitary infrastructure that distinguishes a good life from a difficult one. The apartment is a genuine improvement. I am writing this in one. I would not trade it, but improvements tend to come with losses attached. And the loss that came with the triumph of the private apartment, the loss that I think we are still living with in ways that express themselves in loneliness statistics and in the specific modern phenomenon of living next to someone for years and never learning their name, is the particular texture of life that comes from being known. Not because you chose to be known, but because the architecture of your situation made anonymity impossible. There is a specific statistic that I keep returning to when I think about what we inherited from the collapse of the boarding house. In the United States today, approximately 28% of all households consist of one person living alone. One person. In 1850, at the peak of the boarding house era, that figure was close to 0. Almost nobody lived alone in Victorian America. Almost nobody lived alone in Victorian England. Not because they all had families, many of them did not, but because the economics and the architecture of the era simply did not accommodate solitude. If you were young and working and in a city, you were in a boarding house or in a shared room or in a family household that had taken in a lodger. You were almost by definition in proximity to other people. Whether that was enriching or exhausting depended entirely on the people, but it was real contact, daily, physical, unavoidable contact. The 21st century has given us something the Victorian lodger would have found almost incomprehensibly luxurious: the option to pass an entire day, an entire week, in contact with no living person except through the mediation of a screen. I do not think that option has made us happier on average. I think the Victorian boarding house understood something about human beings that we are currently in the slow and painful process of rediscovering. That we are social creatures, that the table we share matters, that the person in the room next door, the one we did not choose, who hums in the morning and occasionally leaves the bathroom in a condition we have decided is not worth mentioning. That person is not an obstacle to a good life. That person in certain circumstances is a good life. The last Victorian boarding house of the kind we've been visiting. The respectable middle-class establishment with the lace curtains and the landlady who took references and presided at the table did not close on a specific date. It simply became something else. The landlady grew older. The best lodgers left for the suburbs. The house was divided into separate apartments, each with a small kitchen and a private bathroom, each with its own door and its own key, and no shared tablecloth, no common parlor, no weekly Sunday joint that everyone ate together. The last lodger left and took with him, packed invisibly among his few possessions, the fraying boot, the photographs on the mantelpiece shelf, the small object from home that never needed explaining, a whole way of life that the city did not know it was losing until it was already gone. We began this story with a door, a plain door on a plain street, a small brass plate, two words that meant, in the 1870s, that a life was possible here. Rooms available. And behind that door, for 1 month, for 1 year, for 11 years, in Catherine Thorne's remarkable case, a house full of strangers who became not friends exactly, not family, but something for which the 19th century had no precise word and the 21st century has largely no experience. Something in between. Something that required daily effort and daily grace and the repeated choice, at every meal, to be decent to people you had not chosen. Not because they deserved it especially, not because you had been asked, but because the house required it of you, and because you were, in the end, not so different from the people across the table as you had initially assumed. That is the story of the Victorian boarding house. Not the satire, the fusty landlady and the watered-down soup and the boarding house reach for the best piece of mutton. Not the tragedy, the disease, the fraud, the people who fell through the cracks of a system that was never quite adequate to the suffering it was managing. Both of those things were real. We have been through all of it together. But the truest story is something quieter than either of those. It is the story of 8 people sitting around a table on a Sunday afternoon in the autumn of 1878, eating a joint of mutton that is not quite what any of them would have chosen, listening to a man across the table tell a story he has told before, in a room that smells of coal and tea and the particular warmth of other human beings in close proximity, and being, despite everything, not alone. That is all the Victorian boarding house ever was. A way of not being alone. And perhaps that was enough. We've come a long way together tonight. Through the landlady's accounts book and the dining table politics. Through the thin walls and the thin soup. Through the love that formed in parlors where nobody was supposed to notice it. And the ambition that sharpened itself on daily observation. And the small china dog on the mantelpiece shelf that an etiquette guide said you should not have, and that you kept anyway because it was yours. Thank you, genuinely from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for spending these hours inside this house with me, for listening through the long story of a world that no longer exists, but that left us in its passing a question worth sitting with. What is the table you share, and who is sitting across it? I hope tonight, wherever you are, curled up, settled in, the room quiet around you, you feel the warmth of that old house. Not the drafts, not the regulations, the warmth. If this story found you and moved you in any way, please share it with someone who might love it too. Leave a comment telling me where you are and what you're thinking. I read every single one, and they matter to me more than I can properly say. And if you want to know what comes next, if you want to step through another door into another forgotten world that history remembered just long enough to lose, stay close. The next story is already waiting, and something tells me you're going to want to hear it. Also, like and subscribe to my channel, Ancient Tales Sleep US Secrets. Good night, sweet dreams.